Picture the north in the 2nd century gray seas, foaming against rocky shores, pine forests, whispering under endless wind, and the cold air heavy with salt and wood smoke. Out of this misty, half-mythic landscape emerges a people who will one day shake the foundations of Europe, the Goths. They are not yet kings or conquerors, but scattered clans living on the Baltic coasts and islands of southern Scandinavia, especially Gotland, the island that would give them their name. There, beneath low gray skies, they built timber longhouses, buried their chiefs in boat-shaped stone graves, and watched their herds graze along the misted fields. Even in these early centuries, their world was connected to the wider one. Roman coins glittered in their graves, traded for amber furs and slaves. A Roman lady might have worn an amber necklace cut by a Gothic craftsman. A soldier on the Rhine might have drunk from a cup that once passed through Gothic hands. Their life was simple, but not primitive. Families lived together under the rule of a reiks, a local chieftain inside a gards, an enclosed farmstead that sheltered both people and animals through long winters. By the central hearth, the elders told stories of their origins, how the people came from Skansa, the womb of nations, as later legend called it. The language they spoke was early Gothic, a cousin to the tongues of other Germanic tribes, already carrying the sharp, clean rhythms that would echo in Old Norse and English centuries later. On those cold northern coasts, the seeds of Gothic destiny were already stirring. In smoky halls, iron workers hammered fibulae shaped like eagle heads. Women spun thick wool cloaks. Children traced ships in the sand, dreaming of voyages to lands they had never seen. The Roman world to the south was vast and glittering, but it had not yet heard the name of the people who would one day sack its cities, rule its provinces, and inherit its legacy. It begins here, among the pine forests and gray waves, where the mist of the north hides a people ready to move, to conquer, and to be remembered. The sea for the Goths was never a boundary, it was an invitation. When we think of ancient migrations, we might picture weary feet trudging across plains, oxen carts creaking along muddy roads. But for the people of Gotland and southern Sweden, the Baltic was a broad gray-green highway. Their long wooden boats, stitched together with skill and stubborn faith, skimmed over the water, carrying families' livestock and memories toward new horizons. It was not one great exodus all at once, as in the romantic legend of King Bur and his 3 ships, but a steady outflow, generation after generation, like waves lapping endlessly against a shore. By the 2nd century of our era, the Goths were arriving at the mouth of the Vistula River, what is now Poland. The valley there was rich, fertile black soil, lush meadows, forests alive with boar, and elk rivers thick with fish. It must have seemed a land of promise compared to the rockier, thinner soils of Scandinavia. To people used to scraping harvests from short growing seasons here was earth that rewarded labor with abundance. No wonder the Goths settled, and with them they carried a culture already stamped with northern flavor, but quick to take root in this new land. Archaeologists call what they left behind the wheelbark culture. If you close your eyes, you can almost reconstruct it from the clues left in soil and stone. Picture broad timber longhouses rising above the plain, some stretching up to 40 meters with heavy pitched roofs, designed to shrug off rain and snow. These weren't simple huts. They had central hearths, storage areas for food and tools, and even stalls for animals, so that families and livestock shared warmth through the bitter winters. Imagine the smells, a mingling of wood smoke, wet wool manure, and fresh bread baked on flat stones. It was no palace, but it was home. And like any people, the Goths carried their traditions of death along with those of life. Their burial practices in the Vistula Valley reveal both continuity with the north and adaptation to new surroundings. Some dead were cremated, their ashes carefully placed in urns, Others were buried whole, lying with goods intended to accompany them beyond. Weapons, jewelry, pottery, and food offerings all meant to signal status in this world and provide for the next. But a curious thing stands out in many graves: weapons are conspicuously absent. Archaeologists once imagined this meant the Goths were strangely peaceful. Then Bog finds spearheads. Shields' entire caches of swords told a different story. Weapons weren't absent from Gothic life. They were given directly to the gods, sunk in water, sacrificed in rituals echoing older Scandinavian customs. To a Gothic warrior, his spear might belong as much to divine hands as to his own. If you stood on a rise above one of their cemeteries, you would see the stones marking graves arranged in circles or ship shapes. The outlines of vessels carved not in wood, but in stone, like fleets forever moored in the earth. For the Goths, the ship was more than transport. It was a symbol of passage of crossing from one shore of existence to another. The dead in their imagination sailed into the afterlife, just as their ancestors had sailed across the Baltic. Death migration. It was all part of one great voyage. This was no isolated people tucked away in forests. Roman coins appear again and again in Gothic graves, especially in women's burials, sometimes sewn into clothing or worn as pendants. From the 1st to the 3rd centuries, coins minted in Rome found their way north, silent witnesses of trade that tied together worlds. How did they get there? Through amber, most likely. The Baltic shores glittered with it hardened sunlight, the Romans believed. They craved it for jewelry, amulets, even for medicinal purposes. The Goths became middlemen in this trade, funneling amber southward in exchange for silver bronze vessels, glassware, and fine cloth. Imagine a Roman matron in Gaul showing off her amber necklace at a dinner party, oblivious that it was cut and polished by hands that belonged to people her own empire would one day call barbarians. In daily life, Gothic society was both practical and hierarchical. At the top stood the warrior elite men who owned more land, more cattle, and more weapons than their neighbors. Their graves gleam with silver fibulae, shaped like eagle symbols of power and prestige. A Gothic chieftain's hall would have been the center of community life, where disputes were settled, feasts held, warriors rewarded with rings or armlets. But unlike the emperors of Rome, Gothic kings and chiefs could not simply command by decree. Their authority depended on the support of the thing, the assembly of free men. Picture the scene under a vast oak tree. Warriors gather spears raised upright like a forest of steel. They argue loudly, voices booming across the clearing as proposals are shouted down or met with the clang of weapons on shields. The king may speak, but the people answer. Authority was a balance between charisma, ancestry, and consent. Lose the assembly, and even the most decorated warrior could find his support crumble. For ordinary Goths, life was built on farming and herding. Barley, wheat, and millet grew in their fields, while herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs rooted in the pastures. Horses, too, became increasingly important, not just for transport, but as symbols of wealth and status. Women managed households, spun wool, wove cloth, tended gardens, and preserved food. Children learned to tend livestock, to shape clay into vessels, to listen to the stories of their ancestors, and always the horizon called. For these were not people who thought of land as static. It was something to be used, expanded, moved through. Their ancestors had sailed, and so would they. Religion infused every act. The gods of war and fertility traveled with them from Scandinavia, now worshipped in new groves and sacred spaces. Offerings of food and jewelry went into graves, spears into bogs, cattle into sacrificial pits. The name Goth itself may have been tied to gapped a divine figure of authority. To live was to honor the gods. To dishonor them was to court famine, disease, or defeat. It was a worldview, at once harsh and comforting harsh, because life seemed always at the mercy of forces greater than human control. Comforting, because those forces could at least be propitiated with proper ritual. And in the middle of this lived people who were, despite the archaeological grandeur, just people. Picture a Gothic farmer walking home from the fields at dusk, a bundle of tools over his shoulder. He hears the lowing of cattle in the distance, smells wood smoke curling from the longhouse hearth. His wife has bread ready. His children play, outside one proudly whittling a toy sword. Somewhere down the valley, an elder chants stories of how the people came from Scanza. The farmer sits chews on coarse bread and nods along. The story isn't just a tale, it's who he is. And yet, even here, in the safety of fertile valleys, there was unease. The Goths had left Scandinavia, but the restlessness that carried them south did not fade. Word spread of endless grasslands beyond the Carpathians of rivers flowing toward seas warmer and richer than the Baltic. Traders brought not only Roman coins, but also news the Black Sea with its great cities, its fertile plains, its trade routes reaching to Constantinople and beyond. For ambitious chieftains, for restless warriors, the Vistula was not an endpoint, but a launching ground. The wheelbark culture, in all its richness, was only a pause in a much longer journey. The Goths farmed and fought, buried their dead, with ceremony told stories of kings and gods. And yet, like the tide that pulls back from the shore, they were preparing to move again. Eastward, this time to the Pontic steppe, where wheat and horses grew in abundance, and where new enemies and opportunities waited. So as the 2nd and 3rd centuries unfolded, the Gothic story was still only gathering momentum. They had crossed from Scanza to the Vistula, from island to mainland, from myth to history. But already their eyes were lifting to the horizon, and the restless murmur of migration was stirring again in their blood. If you had wandered into a Gothic village sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, say one of the longhouse settlements in the Vistula Valley, you would have found no royal palaces, no marble monuments carved with imperial inscriptions. There were no shining capitals like Rome or Constantinople. Instead, there were long timber halls, smoky with the smell of hearth fires, the laughter of warriors echoing against the rafters, and chieftains seated on wooden benches, heavy brooches glinting on their cloaks. Yet in these halls lived the beginnings of kingship, the kind of leadership that would one day bring Rome itself to its knees. The Goths remembered their earliest kings, not just as men, but as half-legendary figures straddling the line between history and myth. The later historian Jordanes, writing in Constantinople in the 6th century, would tell their stories with grand poetic exaggeration. He spoke of Scanza, the Gothic homeland, across the sea, as the womb of nations. From there, he said a leader named Bur guided the Goths across the waters with only 3 ships. To a modern mind, this sounds almost too tidy, too cinematic. Archaeology suggests migration was slower layered, more complex. But the story of Bur carried a symbolic weight that mattered far more than literal fact. To the Goths, the tale explained who they were, people chosen by the gods to embark on dangerous journeys to cross seas to seize new lands. It was not just history, it was destiny told as bedtime story. Think of it this way. A Gothic boy in a longhouse listens to an elder's voice crackling in the firelight. He hears how King Bur, with only 3 ships, set out into the unknown and found new land. His eyes widen. He clutches a small wooden toy sword. Someday, he thinks, I will sail too. The story teaches him that the Goths are not ordinary farmers, bound forever to their soil. They are movers, wanderers, shapers of fate. The power of a myth like that lies not in whether it happened, but in what it made generations believe about themselves. Kingship among the Goths was not monarchy in the Roman sense. A Gothic reiks, their word for ruler, was more like a first among equals, a man whose authority depended on courage, generosity, and the support of his people. Unlike emperors wrapped in purple robes, Gothic kings had to prove themselves on the battlefield, in the assembly, and in the feast hall. Lose your followers' trust, and you might find yourself deposed, or worse, quietly ignored. Authority was as fragile as the loyalty of the men around you. Picture a Gothic king in his hall. Around him are warriors, his comitatus bound to him, not by bureaucracy, but by personal loyalty. They have pledged their spears to him, and in return, he feeds them clothes, then showers them with gifts, rings, armlets, weapons taken in raids, silver coins from Rome. The more generous the king, the stronger his reputation. A miser had no business ruling the Goths. They wanted leaders who made them feel rich, respected, and remembered. This wasn't a one-man show, though. The assembly of free men balanced royal power. Imagine hundreds of men gathered in a circle beneath a sacred oak, spears raised upright like a forest of iron. The king speaks of his plans, a raid, a treaty, a migration. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Some shout approval, others shake their heads. Decisions weren't made in silence. They were hammered out in the noisy clash of voices. Approval came not through ballots, but by the thunder of weapons on shields. In this way, kingship was tempered by the people. Even the mightiest chieftain had to win the assembly's consent, or else risk rebellion. Religion intertwined with politics in a way that is hard to separate. Many Gothic rulers claimed divine ancestry. The god Gapt, or Gaut, was said to be the progenitor of the Goths, and to trace your line to him was to claim sacred authority. A king wasn't just a man who happened to be strong or wealthy. He was a figure set apart, wrapped in the aura of the gods. Every victory in battle reinforced that aura. Every defeat risked shattering it. In a world where divine favor could mean the difference between a good harvest and famine, a king's spiritual standing mattered as much as his tactical skill. But Gothic kingship wasn't only about war and sacrifice. It was also about feasting, about creating moments of shared memory that stitched together the fabric of loyalty. Picture a great hall in midwinter torches, smoking against the timber walls. A king raises a drinking horn, its rim bound in silver, and offers it to his followers. Songs are sung, sagas recited, boasting matches erupt across the benches. In those moments, bonds are forged as strong as iron. The hall was where loyalty was celebrated, where warriors felt part of something greater than themselves. And yet Gothic kings also lived under constant threat. Leadership was precarious, as much a burden as a gift. A poor harvest, a failed raid, an unlucky defeat could erode loyalty quickly. Unlike emperors, who could rely on bureaucracies and legions to enforce their rule, Gothic rulers depended on persuasion, charisma, and the ability to distribute wealth. When wealth ran out, so too could loyalty. To keep their position, kings had to be generous to the point of extravagance, brave to the point of recklessness, and clever enough to balance the demands of warriors, farmers, priests, and assemblies. The world of early Gothic kingship also carried the weight of continuity with Scandinavia. Burial rites for elites show lavish displays, weapons, jewelry, even imported Roman goods. These weren't just trinkets, they were symbols, reminders to the living that their leader was connected to faraway powers and trade networks, that he stood at the crossroads of worlds. Imagine a Gothic chieftain buried with a Roman glass cup, a silver fibula shaped like an eagle, and a sword laid carefully at his side. His people would not just mourn him, they would see in those grave goods the evidence of his greatness, proof that he had drawn wealth from the empire itself. We can almost hear the echoes of these early kings in later centuries when Gothic leaders like Alaric or Theodoric emerge on the grand stage of Roman history. By then, the scaffolding of kingship was already centuries old, the mix of myth and reality, the balance of democracy and monarchy, the sacred aura and the pragmatic politics of gift-giving. The seeds of those later empires were planted here in the smoky halls of the Vistula Valley. And let's be honest, there's something oddly relatable about it. Strip away the spears and the sacred oaks, and what do we see? A leader trying to win loyalty with charisma, rewards, and a touch of divine branding. A community noisy and opinionated, unwilling to be silenced, making decisions in crowded gatherings. Replace the mead hall with a boardroom or parliament, and suddenly the Goths don't seem so alien. Their kingship was fragile, improvisational, and dependent on personality, much like leadership, everywhere in every age. So in these early centuries, before the Gothic people stormed into the annals of Rome, they were already shaping themselves into something formidable. Kings ruled, but assemblies limited them. Myths gave meaning, but practical politics held sway. Warriors pledged loyalty, but only so long as generosity flowed. A Gothic king was both a warlord and a storyteller, both a leader in battle and a host at the feast. And through it all, the sense grew that the Goths were destined for something larger, that their kings were not simply chiefs of a scattered people, but the first sparks of dynasties that would one day light the fires of history. They had left Scanza behind. They had planted themselves in the Vistula Valley. And under their kings, half real and half legendary, they were learning what it meant to be more than migrants. They were becoming a people who could follow leaders into uncharted lands, who could carry not only their weapons and cattle, but also their myths. Kings gave them direction, identity, and destiny. And destiny, as we know, was waiting just over the horizon. If you were to step into a Gothic village during the height of their settlement in the Vistula Valley, or later on the vast grasslands of the Pontic Steppe, you wouldn't find marble columns or bustling forums like Rome. No philosophers in togas debating logic while sipping watered wine. Instead, you'd find longhouses clustered along rivers, smoke rising into the morning air, and the steady rhythm of life shaped by land kinship and the sharp edge of a spear. Gothic society was many things: practical, hierarchical, spiritual, and stubbornly communal. In their own rugged way, they were as structured as any empire, just without the stone facades. At the top stood the warrior aristocracy, the men whose names carried weight in assemblies and whose jewelry gleamed brighter in the firelight. Their status wasn't just about bloodline, it was about wealth and generosity. A chieftain or king proved his worth by gathering followers and rewarding them well. Loyalty was a kind of currency, and like any currency, it needed regular payments: silver brooches, weapon shares of plunder, or a seat of honor at the feast table. To be a Gothic noble was to play a constant balancing act, maintain your prestige through victory and generosity, or risk slipping back into obscurity. Below them were the free farmers, the backbone of Gothic society. These were not downtrodden peasants, but men and women who owned their land, raised their cattle, and could stand in the assembly with a voice of their own. Their longhouses stretched along fields of barley and wheat, and their oxen plodded steadily through dark earth, turned by wooden plows tipped with iron. They were warriors when called upon, farmers in times of peace, and participants in the great gatherings where decisions were made. A Gothic farmer was free, but his freedom was tied to the community bound to kin, obligated to clan, yet proud of his voice among equals. At the bottom were slaves and dependents, captives taken in raids, debtors forced into servitude, or outsiders absorbed into the household as laborers. Slavery wasn't the sprawling plantation-style economy of Rome, but it was present nonetheless. A slave might tend cattlemen fences or labor in the fields. Some over time could be freed or absorbed into the kin group, especially if they brought useful skills. A captured Roman artisan might become more valuable alive than dead fashioning glassware or repairing tools for his new Gothic masters. Even in bondage, the line between outsider and insider could blur over generations. Family was the bedrock of everything. Kinship ties determined loyalty, inheritance, even vengeance. A wrong done to one man was a wrong to his whole clan, and compensation, what the Germans called Vergild Manpreis, was expected to settle disputes. If compensation was refused, then the feud might spill over into bloodshed, carried on across generations until balance was restored. To be a Goth meant to know your lineage, to know who would stand beside you in a quarrel, and to understand that honor was both your shield and your currency. Daily life revolved around the rhythms of land and season. Women wove wool into heavy cloaks, dyed in earthy reds and browns, or embroidered with simple geometric patterns. They baked bread on flat stones, brewed ale in wooden vats, and tended gardens of herbs and vegetables. Men worked the fields, hunted in forests, and trained constantly with spear and shield. Children grew up, quickly expected to carry chores from a young age, but they also inherited the oral traditions, listening by the hearth, as elders recited the tales of kings and gods. Religion was never far away. The Goths worshipped a pantheon of Germanic deities, gods of war, fertility, and fate. Sacred groves and rivers served as their temples, where sacrifices were offered, weapons cast into bogs, food laid in graves, livestock slaughtered with ritual solemnity. A warrior's spear might be given up to the gods after victory, its sacrifice ensuring future triumphs. To us, it may seem strange to throw a perfectly good weapon into a swamp, but to the Goths, the gods demanded tribute. Better to lose a spear than lose divine favor. The Thing-Their assembly was perhaps the most striking feature of Gothic society. Imagine a field filled with warriors, their spears glinting in the sun. Voices rise in heated argument. Some shout, some jeer, some pound their shields in approval. Here justice is decided, dispute settled, leaders acclaimed. Kings and chieftains could propose, but the people could dispose. It was chaotic, loud, and deeply democratic in its own raw way. Decisions weren't made in secret councils. They were hammered out under open sky, in the presence of free men who refused to be silenced. Law among the Goths was unwritten, but remembered, carried in the minds of elders, sung in half-verse, recited like poetry. A man accused of wrongdoing might be judged by oath-swearing or ordeal, by the testimony of kin, or by the consensus of the assembly. Mercy was not always plentiful, but fairness mattered. Justice was a balance, not a blindfolded statue, but a living process involving community memory and reputation. And through it all, there was art, if not art, in the Roman sense of marble statues, then art worn on the body. The Goths became masters of metalwork, their brooches and fibulae, shaped like eagles, often set with garnets and intricate geometric designs. A brooch was not just a practical fastener for a cloak, it was a statement of identity, a badge of belonging, a glittering advertisement of status. Pottery, too, bore careful stamped patterns, spirals, and lines pressed into clay before firing. Even in the daily act of holding a vessel or pinning a cloak, the Gothic people carried their culture on display. Imagine then a feast in a Gothic hall. Smoke gathers near the rafters, torches flicker, and the air is heavy with the smell of roasted meat. Warriors sit cross-legged on benches, cloaks fastened by shining brooches, drinking horns, sloshing with ale. A chieftain rises, holding up a ring to present to his bravest fighter, and the hall erupts in cheers. At the edges, farmers and free men watch proud to be part of the assembly that sustains their society. Outside the fields stretch into darkness the graves of ancestors marked by stone circles, silent witnesses to the continuity of the people. It was not a world of grandeur, like Rome, nor one of wilderness simplicity. It was a society balanced between freedom and hierarchy, tradition and restlessness. The Goths were farmers, warriors, craftsmen, believers. They lived close to the soil, but looked always beyond the horizon. Their assemblies echoed with noise, their gods with sacrifice, their halls with laughter and the clang of cups. This was the society that would march eastward into the steppe, that would clash with emperors, that would build kingdoms in Italy and Spain. But for now, in the Vistula and beyond, they were simply Goths, hard-working, loud, proud, deeply rooted, and already preparing, perhaps unknowingly, for the storms to come. The Goths were never a people content to stay still for long. Their ancestors had crossed seas. Their fathers had left forests behind. And now, by the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the same restlessness began stirring again. The fertile lands of the Vistula Valley had served them well. Grain grew tall, cattle multiplied, and graves grew heavy with silver and amber. But whispers of new horizons carried on trade routes. Beyond the Carpathian Mountains lay a land so vast it seemed endless, the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Black soil, rich enough to feed whole nations' rivers flowing south into the Black Sea, and pastures rolling like an ocean of grass. For a people already half seafarers and half farmers, it was an irresistible promise. The archaeological record shows it clearly. Settlements in Poland were slowly abandoned, longhouses dismantled, and precious goods buried in secret hoards hidden away, as if the people knew they could not carry everything into the unknown. Entire communities uprooted themselves and moved eastward, following river valleys and trade paths that wound through mountain passes. Imagine the caravan carts groaning under the weight of children, grain stores, and livestock, warriors carrying spears slung over their shoulders, women balancing baskets of tools and cloth. It was not a hasty flight, but a steady tide of migration, wave after wave. When they finally spilled into the Pontic steppe, the heart of modern Ukraine and southern Russia, they found a land unlike anything they had ever known. Gone were the dense forests and sheltered valleys. Instead, the horizon stretched forever, a sea of grass shifting in the wind. Villages sat atop river bluffs, their fields spreading out below, while herds of cattle and horses grazed in vast open pastures. The Goths were farmers, yes, but they were also adaptable. They learned to blend their northern traditions with steppe ways, creating a society that combined settled agriculture with a touch of nomadic mobility. This new culture has a name, the Chernyakov culture, a hybrid world that thrived between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Here, Gothic traditions fused with those of the Sarmatian Scythians and other tribes who had long roamed the steppe. You can almost see it in the artifacts pottery that blends Germanic patterns with Roman forms, brooches decorated with both Gothic geometry and steppe animal motifs, houses built sturdier, but also villages placed in defensive clusters, wary of raids. The steppe was not empty. Sarmatian tribes had ruled here for centuries, with their iron-clad cavalry horsemen, bristling with lances and scale armor that glittered like fish scales in the sun. Their tactics, swift, mobile, devastating, would shape Gothic warfare for generations. Some Goths fought, them others joined them. And in time, Sarmatian cavalry became part of Gothic armies, creating a fusion of infantry discipline and mounted shock power. The ghosts of the Scythians, too, lingered. Artisans still practiced their goldsmithing, their designs influencing Gothic jewelers who crafted eagle-headed fibulae studded with garnets. To be Gothic in the steppe was to be part of a cultural melting pot, and the Goths embraced it without losing their core identity. Villages here were not haphazard. Excavations show carefully planned layouts, homes arranged around central courtyards, granaries sunk into the earth workshops, where blacksmiths hammered iron into plowshares and sword blades. Some settlements sprawled across 100 hectares, housing thousands. This was not a ragged band of migrants. It was an organized people building a new homeland. Imagine standing on a bluff, overlooking such a village, smoke rising from dozens of hearths, children chasing each other in the dust horses, tethered in rows, and above it all, the sound of hammers striking iron, shaping both tools and destiny. The Goths prospered in this new land. Their fields yielded wheat, barley, and millet stored in vast sunken granaries, capable of feeding large populations. Their herds provided milk, wool, and hides. Trade routes brought them into closer contact with Rome than ever before. Amber from the Baltic still flowed southward, while Roman wineglass and silver moved northward. Hordes of Roman coins buried in Gothic lands tell the story of a people deeply entangled with the empire, not as subjects, but as partners in a relationship that veered constantly between trade and raid. And in this wide open landscape, their political structures began to change. A people who had once gathered under the Thing now faced the challenge of organizing across vast distances and diverse populations. Different clans, Sarmatians, Scythians, and other Germanic tribes all had to be managed. Out of necessity rose powerful chieftains' men, whose graves gleam with extraordinary wealth, gold-hilted swords, silver belts, imported Roman goods. Leadership shifted from the small-scale kingship of the Vistula Valley toward territorial rulers who claimed authority over specific lands. A Gothic ruler in the steppe was no longer just a warlord of a clan. He was the master of thousands, the protector of settlements, the collector of tribute. Religion too adapted. Pagan practices remained the gods of war. Fertility and fate were still honored with sacrifices of weapons, animals, and treasure, but new influences seeped in. Sarmatian horse burials mingled with Gothic rituals, creating hybrid ceremonies where a warrior might be buried not only with his sword and brooch, but with his armored horse as well. Scythian art styles crept into religious artifacts. It was a flexible, adaptive faith, always willing to absorb useful practices without surrendering its core. And yet, beneath the prosperity, the seeds of division were being sown. The vastness of the steppe, the diversity of its people, and the sheer scale of Gothic settlement would eventually force the emergence of two distinct confederations, the Tervings, later called Visigoths, in the west, and the Greuthungs, Ostrogoths, in the east. Each developed different ways of life, different economies, and different relationships with Rome. But for now, in these early centuries of settlement, the Goths basked in their success. They had left their stone ship graves behind crossed rivers and mountains and carved out a new world on the open plains. Imagine the scene at dusk, the sky burning gold over endless grass, a Gothic village alive with the hum of voices, warriors tending their horses, farmers unloading sheaves of grain into deep granaries, children playing with miniature spears carved from wood. In the distance, the silhouettes of riders appear against the horizon, horsemen moving like shadows across the steppe. The Goths had arrived, and in their new land, they were stronger than ever. But of course, strength brings attention. Rome was watching. So were other tribes. And soon, the Goths would not simply be farmers and traders on the steppe, they would be warriors whose names echoed in the halls of emperors. On the broad sweep of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the Goths thrived. They had left behind the forests of the north and settled into a rhythm of farming rich black soil, grazing herds across boundless grass, and trading down rivers that led to the Black Sea. Yet no society expands forever without change. As Gothic settlements spread out, hundreds of villages scattered from the Carpathians to the Dniester, from the Dniester to the Don. The challenges of governing such vast and varied lands began to press heavily on their leaders. Out of this strain came something new, the splitting of the Gothic world into two great confederations, each with its own identity, economy, and destiny. To the west of the Dniester River, the Goths, who became known as the Tervings, later remembered as the Visigoths, found themselves in a land of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and access to the Danube frontier. These lands encouraged settlement, fortified villages, fields tilled with heavy plows, and courts where chieftains ruled from fixed seats of power. The Tervings grew increasingly tied to Rome, both through trade and through constant skirmishes along the border. Their kings began to look less like wandering warlords and more like territorial rulers who built administrative centers, collected tribute, and even adopted hints of Roman pomp. Archaeology shows this in the emergence of stone-lined burial chambers and richly adorned elite graves. A Terving noble might rest for eternity, surrounded by silver belt fittings, imported silk and garnet-studded brooches, a statement of wealth drawn as much from Roman connections as from Gothic tradition. Meanwhile, east of the Dniester, on the wide-open grasslands, another branch of the Gothic people took shape: the Greuthungs, the future Ostrogoths. Their lands lacked the natural defenses of the West. There were no mountain valleys or thick forests to shelter them, only the rolling expanse of the steppe. Here, mobility was everything. The Greuthungs developed into a more cavalry-heavy society, absorbing Sarmatian tactics and breeding horses prized for their speed and endurance. Their settlements tended to be smaller and more mobile, easy to abandon and rebuild if danger pressed too close. Power among the Greuthungs was more fluid. Chieftains rose and fell, depending on their ability to command loyalty through raids, conquests, and charisma. A king of the Greuthungs had to be not only generous, but also terrifyingly effective in war. The environment shaped not only their economies, but also their cultures. Among the Tervings, life revolved around agriculture villages and increasingly elaborate systems of governance. Kings established courts in fortified settlements, drawing around them craftsmen, merchants, and warriors. Theirs was a world of hierarchy and administration, one where tribute was collected, disputes were settled in halls, and wealth concentrated in the hands of a noble elite. By contrast, the Greuthungs embodied the fierce mobility of the steppe. Their wealth was measured in herds, their power in the speed of their cavalry. Their politics were looser, their settlements more scattered, their leaders less tied to fixed courts and more to the shifting fortunes of war. Religion, too, diverged subtly. The Tervings, rubbing shoulders with Rome, began to absorb influences from Mediterranean religious practices. Archaeologists find evidence of Roman-style votive offerings, alongside traditional Germanic weapon sacrifices, a blend of two worlds. Their burials became grander, echoing the hierarchical society forming around them. The Greuthungs, on the other hand, clung more firmly to older Germanic traditions. Their gods traveled with them in portable shrines, their ceremonies performed under open sky wherever the herds led them. Golden arm rings inscribed with runes invoked divine protection, serving as both jewelry and sacred talisman. Even language began to shift. Both groups still spoke Gothic, that East Germanic tongue preserved in fragments of Ulfilas's later Bible translation. But subtle differences crept in. The Tervings borrowed Latin words from their Roman neighbors, especially for things like wine silk or military ranks. The Greuthungs picked up terms from Sarmatian and other steppe peoples' words for horses' weapons and raiding tactics. By the 4th century, Gothic speech was beginning to diverge into dialects still mutually intelligible, but colored by environment and neighbors. Militarily, the Tervings built a mixed force of infantry and cavalry. Their farmers-turned-soldiers fought in disciplined shield walls supported by smaller mounted units that could harry or pursue. They fortified their settlements, learning siegecraft from Roman deserters and prisoners, creating armies capable of both defense and assault. The Greutungs, by contrast, embraced the thunder of cavalry. Their warriors fought from horseback with lances, bows, and sabers. Their armies were fast, flexible, able to strike across vast distances, vanish, and regroup. They were the embodiment of the steppe's endless horizon, mobile, elusive, dangerous. Yet for all their differences, both confederations still thought of themselves as Goths. They shared the same myths of origin, the same stories of Skansa, the same pride in being a people apart from Rome, even as they traded with it. They wore similar fibulae, crafted pottery, with the same geometric decorations, sang of the same gods by different fires. The split was not yet a divorce. It was a branching, like two rivers flowing from the same source, destined to carve different valleys, but still carrying the same waters. It is tempting with hindsight to see the division as the first cracks in a unity that could never hold. But to the Goths of the 3rd century, it was simply adaptation. The land demanded new ways of life, and the people answered. The Tervings grew more Roman in style, the Greutungs more steppe-like. Together, they created a Gothic world that stretched from forests to plains, from villages to horse camps, from the edge of Rome's frontier to the distant Don. But the steppe is never a place of rest for long. To the east, unseen, but already stirring, were the Huns riders who would make even Greutung horsemen tremble. For now, though, the Goths stood ascendant, their twin confederations strong, adaptable, and increasingly ambitious. The Romans on the Danube began to feel the pressure. Gothic raiding parties tested the frontier, probing fortifications, carrying off loot. Diplomats shuttled back and forth. Treaties were struck and broken. The empire looked north and saw not just barbarians, but two rising powers who might either be allies or enemies. On a summer evening, you can imagine a Gothic king of the Tervings sitting in his hall, silver goblet in hand, discussing Roman envoys who had just departed. At the same time, far to the east, a Greutung warlord mounted his horse beneath the endless sky, his warriors gathered with lances glinting in the sun, ready to ride. Two worlds, two futures, one people balanced on the edge of destiny. The Danube River was more than a blue ribbon cutting across Europe. For centuries, it had been the beating frontier of the Roman world, a border where legions stood watch in stone fortresses and patrols scouted the opposite shore. South of the river, order marble cities, taxes emperors. North of the river, the restless hum of tribes, farmers, raiders, dreamers, who watched Rome with equal measures of envy and disdain. By the 3rd century, the Goths had settled firmly on that northern bank, close enough to smell Roman cooking smoke when the wind was right. Inevitably, curiosity and hunger drew them into conflict. At first, encounters were almost casual. Small war bands probed across the river, stealing cattle, testing Roman defenses, retreating into forests and marshes before legions could respond. To the Goths, raiding wasn't just profit, it was training, prestige, and sometimes necessity. A young warrior proved himself by crossing the Danube and returning with plunder or prisoners. To the Romans, of course, it was barbarian insolence that demanded retribution. Yet the empire was overstretched. Armies were shuffling constantly between frontiers, dealing with Persians in the east rebellions in Gaul, and endless civil wars of emperors rising and falling faster than you could memorize their names. Against this chaos, Gothic raids were gnats biting at a weary giant. Trade and diplomacy ran alongside conflict. Roman merchants slipped northward, eager to barter glassware bronze vessels and fine wine for amber furs and Gothic slaves. Envoys traveled back and forth, sometimes bringing gifts, sometimes ultimatums. To a Gothic chieftain, Rome was both opportunity and threat, a source of wealth to be exploited, a neighbor to be feared. Treaties were made, and treaties were broken often in the same decade. The Goths were learning fast how to play the game of imperial politics. The Romans, for their part, underestimated these newcomers. To them, the Goths seemed like just another tribe along the endless barbarian frontier, fierce yes, but manageable, no different from the Marcomanni Vandals or countless others. What they didn't realize was that the Goths were different in scale and cohesion. Unlike smaller tribes, they had already begun to form broad confederations pooling manpower from dozens of villages and clans. A Gothic raid wasn't a few dozen warriors slipping across the river anymore. It was hundreds, sometimes thousands, moving with coordination that suggested more than opportunism. Rome would learn this lesson painfully. Consider the year 238 AD. The empire was reeling from crisis. Emperors' murdered armies stretched thin enemies pressing on every side. For the Goths, this was an opening too tempting to ignore. Warbands surged across the Danube numbering in the thousands and struck at Roman provinces with shocking audacity. This was no cattle raid. They besieged fortified towns, cut Roman supply lines, and carried off treasure by the wagon load. Roman commanders, already overwhelmed, struggled to mount an effective response. What the Goths discovered was intoxicating the empire could bleed. Their confidence grew with each success. Soon, Gothic leaders began to coordinate larger campaigns. Fortified camps were established on Roman soil, temporary strongholds that turned raids into full-fledged occupations. They learned siegecraft from captured engineers, building rams and towers from local timber. No longer content with quick strikes, they could now starve out cities over months. The Romans, who had long prided themselves on their superiority in engineering and discipline, suddenly faced barbarians who had borrowed their own tricks. And yet, even in this rising tide of violence, the relationship between Goths and Romans remained strangely complex. Gothic chieftains sent embassies south, offering peace in exchange for subsidies or favorable trade. Roman emperors sometimes obliged paying gold rather than spilling blood. To the empire, such payments were humiliating but practical. To the Goths, they were trophies proof that mighty Rome could be made to bargain. Some Gothic leaders even entered Roman service fighting as allies or mercenaries, learning Latin commands and absorbing Roman tactics firsthand. The border was less a wall than a permeable membrane leaking warriors' goods and ideas in both directions. One can imagine the conversations in a Gothic hall after a successful raid. Warriors still flushed with adrenaline boast of Roman loot silk cloaks, silver dishes, strange wines that burned the throat. The chieftain lifts a Roman glass goblet, delicate and shimmering in the firelight, and declares that more such treasures lie just across the river. The young men cheer spears, striking against shields. For them, Rome is both adversary and inexhaustible treasury, waiting to be cracked open again and again. For Rome's soldiers, the Gothic presence was more unnerving. A sentry on the Danube frontier might hear whispers in the night, the sound of oars slicing water. Smoke might rise in the distance from a village torched by raiders. And worse, there was the sense that the enemy was learning, adapting, becoming harder to repel with each passing year. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Goths were no longer simply border irritants. They were emerging as a force that could challenge the empire on equal terms. Their raids grew bolder, their leaders more ambitious, their armies larger. The Danube, once a reliable boundary, had become a contested space where the balance of power tilted dangerously. What began as probing raids and cautious treaties was evolving into something larger, darker, and more permanent. The Goths had tested Rome and found its armor cracked. They would not stop now. By the mid-3rd century, the relationship between Rome and the Goths had shifted from border nuisance to existential threat. What had begun as raids of opportunity quick strikes across the Danube, followed by hasty retreats, had grown into something more organized, more deliberate. The Goths were no longer content with stealing cattle or carrying off a few villagers. They were learning to strike at the heart of Roman provinces, to besiege fortified cities, and to bend the empire itself to their will. Imagine being a Roman governor in the Balkans around 250 AD. You sit in your provincial villa, writing reports to the emperor about tax revenues and grain shipments. When word arrives, thousands of Goths have crossed the Danube. They are not drifting warbands. They are an army. Worse, they are building camps, fortifying positions, and preparing sieges. For a Roman commander, raised on the idea that barbarians came, burned, and vanished, this is a nightmare. The Goths are learning the Roman playbook and turning its pages with unnerving speed. The raids grew larger, almost resembling military campaigns. In 238, 80 Gothic warbands, numbering in the thousands, stormed into Roman territory, and by 250 AD, their ambitions had expanded to full-on assaults on cities. They besieged Histria, a Black Sea port. They surrounded Philippopolis, a vital city in Thrace. For the Romans, these were not just border forts, but real urban centers with walls, markets, temples, and thousands of citizens. That the Goths could lay siege to them was shocking. Siege warfare had long been considered the empire's domain, a skill barbarians supposedly lacked. And yet, here were the Goths erecting wooden towers, battering rams, and earthworks guided by Roman captives pressed into service, or by deserters who had defected. To the terrified citizens behind the walls, the sight must have been surreal. Men they had long dismissed as hairy wild northerners, now operating siege engines with patience and persistence. And the patience paid off. Cities fell one by one. When Philippopolis was taken in 250 AD, the Goths carried off vast quantities of loot, including gold jewels and thousands of prisoners. The empire shuddered. What made the Gothic threat so devastating was not only their growing sophistication, but also Rome's growing weakness. The mid-3rd century was the empire's age of crisis. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, assassinated by their own soldiers, overthrown by rivals, or killed in battle. Armies were constantly shuffled from one frontier to another, fighting Persians in the east, rebels in the west, and endless pretenders within. In this chaos, the Danube frontier was left thinly defended. When the Goths came, there were fewer legions to meet them. The Romans were learning bitterly that the Goths were not simply raiders, they were occupiers. Unlike earlier tribes who struck and fled Gothic armies, established fortified camps deep inside Roman territory. They dug trenches, built palisades, and defended their positions against counterattacks. They raided the countryside, methodically, stripping it of food and wealth, enslaving whole populations. Then when they chose to withdraw, it was not because Rome drove them out, but because Gothic leaders decided they had enough plunder, or because their homelands were under threat from rivals forcing them to return. The psychological toll on Rome was immense. Imagine news, traveling along imperial roads, a city has fallen, its population enslaved, its treasures carted away. Refugees pour into safer provinces carrying tales of horror. Rumors grow faster than facts. Stories of Gothic armies numbering in the tens of thousands of Roman legions, slaughtered wholesale of barbarian kings crowned in Roman territory. Even if exaggerated, such tales stoked fear. For a people long accustomed to believing that Rome was invincible, the very idea that barbarians could storm cities was shattering. Yet Gothic raids were not only destructive, they were also transformative for the Goths themselves. Roman captives brought new skills into Gothic communities: blacksmithing, engineering, literacy, even Christianity. Roman silver and gold financed Gothic kings, allowing them to reward their warriors with lavish gifts. And every successful raid reinforced the prestige of Gothic leaders, drawing more clans into their confederations. It was a cycle raid, Rome grow stronger raid again. To the Goths, Rome was both adversary and resource. They looted its treasures, but they also admired its wealth. They despised Roman arrogance, yet they learned eagerly from Roman tactics. It was a love-hate relationship in the most destructive sense. The Goths could not yet dream of ruling Rome, but they could certainly dream of plundering it again and again. Picture a Gothic camp in Roman territory. Rows of tents circle a central fire. Captured Roman siege engines loom like strange beasts, their wooden frames creaking. Warriors feast on stolen cattle, Roman wine sloshing from unfamiliar amphorae. A chieftain rises wearing a Roman officer's cloak, taken as spoil, and declares their next target. Cheers erupt. For the young warriors, Rome is a proving ground, a place to win glory, wealth, and stories to tell their sons. And in those camps, the seeds of future Gothic kingdoms were quietly being planted. They were learning not only how to fight Rome, but how to live off Roman wealth, how to rule captured lands, how to absorb outsiders into their ranks. They were becoming something more than migrants or raiders. They were becoming conquerors in training. Rome, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that it was no longer the teacher, but the student in this brutal exchange. The Goths had watched, learned, and adapted. The empire would soon pay the highest price for underestimating them. It was the summer of 251 AD, and the air in Moesia Superior was thick with tension. The Roman Emperor Decius, a grizzled veteran who had seized the purple only a couple of years before, marched north with his son and co-emperor Herennius Etruscus. Their mission was simple in principle, but deadly in practice, to teach the Goths a lesson, to remind these newcomers from the northern mists that Rome was still master of the world. The Goths, under their king Seneva, had been running rampant through the Balkans, storming cities, burning towns, and even capturing the great city of Philippopolis. For Rome, this was humiliation. For Decius, it was intolerable. The two armies met near a place called Abritus in modern Bulgaria. To the Romans, the battle must have felt like a chance at redemption. The legions had marched in good order, banners snapping in the wind armor, glittering in the sun. The emperor himself rode at their head, determined to wipe away the stain of Gothic raids. But the Goths had chosen the battlefield, and that was the first sign of Roman miscalculation. Abritus was marshy ground dotted with wetlands and streams. To heavily armored legionaries, this was a nightmare. To Gothic warriors accustomed to moving across rough terrain, it was an opportunity. Neva, crafty and deliberate, lured the Romans into positions where their formations broke apart, where shields and spears lost their cohesion in mud and reeds. Then the Goths struck fast, hard, relentless. Picture the scene: Roman infantry struggling knee-deep in muck shields, slipping spears thrusting without force. From the edges, Gothic cavalry thundered down their lances, crashing into flanks. Archers loosed volleys into the confused Roman ranks, and in the chaos, the unthinkable happened. Both Decius and his son were killed. Ancient sources say Herennius fell first, struck by an arrow. His father, refusing to retreat, is said to have declared, "The death of one soldier is not a great loss to the Republic. Noble words, but he too was soon cut down, swallowed by the mire and the Gothic charge. The death of a Roman emperor on the battlefield was rare, shocking, almost unthinkable. Rome had seen emperors murdered in palaces, poisoned in banquets, stabbed in alleys, but to fall in battle against so-called barbarians, that was catastrophe. Decius was the first emperor ever killed in combat by foreign enemies. News of his death rippled like a thunderclap through the empire. If the emperor himself could not stand against the Goths, who could? For the Goths, the victory at Abritus was nothing short of transformative. They had not merely won a raid or a siege, they had annihilated a Roman army and slain its emperor. In the smoky camps that night, Gothic warriors must have feasted with wild pride. The empire that had seemed untouchable was suddenly mortal. Plunder was distributed: Roman armor, weapons, coins, jewelry, ripped from noble corpses. And perhaps more intoxicating than silver or gold was the sense of power that the Goths had faced the might of Rome and broken it. The aftermath was messy for both sides. Rome scrambled to elect a new emperor, Trebonianus Gallus, who quickly realized he could not simply defeat the Goths by force. Instead, he made peace, agreeing to pay them annual subsidies of gold and allowing them to retreat north with their spoils and captives. To many Romans, this was disgraceful, a humiliating admission of weakness. To the Goths, it was validation. They had forced Rome to buy peace on Gothic terms. It is hard to overstate how profound this moment was. Rome had built its identity on superiority, disciplined legions, unbroken walls, the sense that barbarians could raid at the edges but never topple the core. At Abritus, that illusion cracked. The Goths had proven themselves not just opportunists, but a military force capable of defeating an emperor in open battle. And for the Goths, the victory cemented new possibilities. They were no longer wanderers or raiders. They were players on the stage of empire feared and respected. Word spread among neighboring tribes. The Goths had slain an emperor. The Goths had plundered cities. The Goths had humbled Rome. Warriors from other peoples drifted toward their banners, eager to share in the spoils of future campaigns. Imagine the stories told in Gothic halls after Abritus. Elders describing how Roman lines broke in the marsh, how the emperor fell, how the gods had smiled upon their people. Young boys listening wide-eyed would grow up believing that Rome was not invincible, that the Goths had a destiny of their own. In that sense, Abritus was not just a battle. It was a myth in the making, the moment when the Gothic self-image shifted from outsider to contender. Of course, the Romans would fight back. They always did. The empire still had armies, fortresses, and resources. But something irreversible had happened. The Danube frontier would never feel quite as secure again. The Goths had tasted imperial blood, and they would not forget its flavor. When we think of the Goths, it's easy to imagine them as the eternal pagans of Roman nightmares, wild men with spears, shouting in strange tongues, their gods hungry for sacrifice. But history, as always, has a sense of irony. For even as Gothic warriors shattered Roman armies on the battlefield, their children and captives were quietly being converted by Roman faith. The empire that couldn't conquer them by sword began without realizing it to conquer them by scripture. It began humbly, as most revolutions do not with kings or priests, but with prisoners. Every raid that stormed across the Danube brought back Roman captives, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and among them, Christians. These prisoners, carried off to Gothic villages, brought their faith with them. They prayed in secret, sang hymns in Latin or Greek that no Goth could understand, and told stories of a single God who died on a cross. To their captors, it must have seemed strange, at first pitiful even, But the Goths had always been curious practical. They respected strength, and Christianity offered a different kind of strength, spiritual endurance, a quiet confidence that no sword could cut through. By the early 4th century, the new faith had begun to spread beyond captives. Some Goths, especially those who had served as mercenaries in Roman armies, returned home not only with gold, but with the teachings of this strange religion. The empire itself was changing too. When Constantine made Christianity the state religion, it was no longer a persecuted cult, but the faith of emperors. Suddenly, believing in Christ was not just a spiritual choice, it was a cultural statement. For ambitious Gothic leaders, adopting Christianity offered more than salvation. It offered legitimacy. It connected them to the greatest civilization on earth. But here's the twist. The Goths did not become Roman Christians. They embraced a variant, the Arian form of Christianity, named for Arius, a theologian, who argued that Jesus was divine, but not equal to God the Father. To the Catholic Romans, this was heresy. To the Goths, it made sense. Their culture already understood hierarchy, a great king, above lesser kings, warriors beneath their leaders, and all beneath the gods. The idea of a son who was mighty but subordinate to the Father felt natural to them, even comforting. And into this world of shifting faith stepped one of the most remarkable figures in Gothic history, a man named Ulfilas, or Wulfila, whose name meant little wolf. Born around 301 AD to a Gothic father and a Cappadocian mother, captured in earlier raids, he was raised at the crossroads of two civilizations. Fluent in both Gothic and Greek, he was a bridge between worlds, half barbarian, half Roman, a man who understood the mind of each. In his youth, Ulfilas was sent to Constantinople as a hostage, an old Roman practice for securing alliances. There, he received a Roman education and studied theology under the guidance of Arian bishops. When he returned to Gothic lands, he came not as a captive, but as a missionary. Around 341 AD, he was consecrated a bishop and began preaching among his people, spreading Christianity not with the sword, but with the word. And what words they were! Ulfilas faced an impossible task. His people had no written language. Their legends and laws were spoken sung, remembered, but never written down. So the bishop did something extraordinary. He invented an alphabet. Drawing from Greek, Latin, and even runic symbols, he created a script capable of capturing Gothic sounds and rhythms. For the first time, the Gothic tongue could live on parchment. With it, he translated most of the Bible, producing the first scripture ever written in a Germanic language. Picture him at his desk, perhaps in a small monastery somewhere near the Black Sea. The light of an oil lamp flickers across sheets of parchment stained purple, the ink shimmering silver and gold. Around him, a few young Gothic scribes. Their brows furrowed, painstakingly trace letters that have never before existed. In the beginning was the Word. They copy each syllable, anchoring an oral people into the written world. Ulfilas's translation was more than a religious act, it was a cultural revolution. Through it, the Goths began to see themselves as part of a divine story that stretched beyond their own hills and steppes. Christianity gave their warriors moral order, their leaders divine legitimacy, and their people a new identity that transcended tribal divisions. Yet even as they embraced Christ, they remained Gothic at heart. Their churches were built of wood, not marble. Their priests wore cloaks, not Roman robes, and their faith, though Christian, still bore the flavor of the steppe, proud, independent, and wary of outside control. For the Roman Church, however, this Arian Christianity was a problem. The Goths' version of faith set them apart, not only from pagans, but from Orthodox Romans themselves. To the empire, they were both brothers in belief, and heretics at the gate, a paradox that would define centuries of uneasy coexistence. When Gothic armies later marched through Roman lands, they would spare churches, but sack palaces. They saw themselves not as enemies of Christianity, but as its purer, older form. And yet, for all the theological complexity, what truly mattered was how the new faith reshaped Gothic life. Law codes began to reflect Christian mercy. The old blood feuds softened under teachings of forgiveness. Slaves and captives were treated, at least in theory, with more humanity. A moral dimension entered politics. Kings claimed to rule not just by might, but by God's favor. The very concept of divine kingship, once rooted in pagan myth, found a new home in Christian ideology. Imagine a Gothic village at dusk in this new age. The sacred groves still stand, but their altars are quiet. From one longhouse faintly comes the sound of chanting not to Odin or Gapt, but to Christ. A wooden cross hangs where once a carved idol stood. The people gather, listening to the bishop's words in their own tongue. For the first time, the mysteries of Scripture are not confined to Latin or Greek, they belong to them. The faith that had once belonged to Rome has crossed the frontier, reimagined in the language of those who once raided its cities. And yet the story of Gothic Christianity was not simply peaceful. It would become both a unifying force and a dividing line. When the Goths would later settle inside the empire, their Arian faith would set them apart from the Catholic Romans they ruled, fueling mistrust and tension. But in this moment, in the 4th century, it was still new, still vibrant, still filled with promise. The Goths, once defined by their swords and migrations, now held in their hands something even more: enduring words. Words that could outlive kings and kingdoms, inscribed in silver and gold upon purple pages. In embracing the Christian faith and shaping it in their own image, they had taken their place not just in the empire's history, but in the history of civilization itself. It began as a whisper across the steppe, rumors of horsemen from the Far East, so swift that their arrows seemed to arrive before the sound of their hooves. At first, the Goths laughed. They had heard such tales before about monstrous tribes living beyond the Dawn people who drank blood and never built houses. Every age has its legends of distant terrors. But this time, the terror was real. By the late 4th century, the Huns had burst into history like a storm with no warning. No one knew quite where they came from. Some said, from beyond the Sea of Grass, others from the dark lands east of the Caspian. What mattered was how they moved. They lived entirely on horseback, men and beasts fused into a single living weapon. Their armor was stitched from hardened leather. Their bows, small and deadly, could pierce through iron. To the Goths, they must have seemed more like a force of nature than an army black silhouettes rolling out of the eastern horizon with the sunrise blazing behind them. The Greuthungs, the Eastern Goths, were the first to feel the shock. One moment, they were the masters of the steppe. The next, they were its prey. Villages burned overnight. Herds were driven off. Chieftains, who had ruled for generations, found themselves surrounded by riders who attacked with terrifying speed and vanished before dawn. A Gothic warband might try to stand and fight, but the Huns didn't fight like men, they fought like wind and fire. Their horses were small but tireless, trained to obey knees and whistles. Their arrows came in swarms arcing through the air before any shield wall could close. A Gothic spear was useless against an enemy who refused to meet it head-on. The steppe, once the Goths' ally, now betrayed them, flat open, merciless. There was nowhere to hide. Archaeologists later found entire layers of destruction in the lands once held by the Eastern Goths' villages. Torched graves disturbed hastily buried treasures, hidden by people who never returned to reclaim them. The Huns didn't merely raid, they shattered societies. Chieftains, who survived, either fled west or bent the knee to the new overlords. Those who resisted were destroyed. Their warriors enslaved, their families scattered. Imagine the terror spreading like wildfire. Messengers galloping westward, their horses lathered with sweat carrying warnings. They're coming. They burn everything. They kill the chiefs. They take the children. Camps emptied overnight. Families packed wagons with whatever they could carry, grain, livestock, jewelry, icons of the new Christian faith, and joined the refugee tide rolling toward the safety of the Danube frontier. Among these desperate people were the Turvings, the Western Goths. Their king Fritigern watched as wave after wave of refugees poured into his territory, bringing stories of ruin. The Greutungs, once powerful, proud, and rich, were now broken. Their kings slain or enslaved, their warriors scattered, their women and children taken. It was said that the Huns carried chains of captives like rivers of human misery stretching across the steppe. Fritigern faced an impossible choice. To stand and fight meant annihilation. To flee meant submission to Rome. It was a bitter irony. The Goths had spent generations fighting Rome for land, for honor, for survival. Now, to escape extinction, they would have to beg Rome for mercy. But before that desperate choice, there must have been moments of grim reflection. Picture a Gothic village at dusk, the wind howling over the plains, families huddled around meager fires. A mother whispers to her children to sleep quietly, though sleep will not come. A warrior sharpens his spear, knowing it will do little good. The elders stare eastward into darkness, where the glow of distant fires marks the advance of their doom. The Huns came not only with speed, but with psychological warfare. Roman historians who loved horror stories described them as demons short-scarred with faces carved by ritual cuts in childhood, their cheeks marked by scars that gave them the appearance of having no beards. Their language was harsh and guttural, their songs unnerving. They did not farm, they did not build, they did not stay. They devoured what they conquered and moved on. For the Goths, who prided themselves on their order, on kings' councils and kinship, this chaos was unimaginable. They had once thought themselves lords of the steppe. Now they were wanderers again, exiles fleeing an enemy who could not be reasoned with. The memory of their own migrations from Scanza must have haunted them. Had they not, too, once swept aside weaker peoples? Now the wheel had turned. Fritigern and his nobles held council. The choice was clear: cross the Danube into Roman lands, or be destroyed. Beyond that river lay safety, Roman cities, Roman walls, Roman food stores. But to cross it, they would need permission. And so began one of the most desperate diplomatic gambits in ancient history, the Visigoths, proud descendants of warriors who had killed an emperor, begging Rome to let them in. For the Romans, the sight must have been astonishing. Tens of thousands of Goths, men, women, children, ox carts, horses, wagons, stretching for miles along the northern bank of the Danube waiting. Behind them, the eastern horizon glowed red with the fires of the advancing Huns. Before them, the river rolled like a barrier between two worlds. The empire hesitated. Letting in such a vast people was dangerous, but denying them could push the refugees into desperation and rebellion. And so, with a mixture of pity, arrogance, and miscalculation, the Roman authorities agreed. The Goths would be allowed to cross the Danube and settle as foederati federates bound by treaty to serve the empire. They would hand over their weapons, live under Roman supervision, and provide soldiers in exchange for land and food. A fragile bargain sealed in fear and desperation. But bargains with Rome had a way of turning sour. In the years to come, this river crossing would change the course of European history. For now, though, as the last wagons rattled down to the water's edge and the first Gothic families ferried across, there must have been a deep, uneasy silence. Behind them, rode the Huns, the shadow that had devoured the East. Ahead waited Rome, the empire that would soon regret opening its gates. The storm from the east had driven the Goths to the river. The next storm of betrayal, starvation, and revenge was waiting on the far shore. It was the summer of 376 AD, and the Danube shimmered under the hot sun like a blade of silver between two worlds. On its northern bank stretched the lands of the Goths, smoldering ruins, empty villages, fields trampled by horses. Beyond the southern bank rose the frontiers of the Roman Empire, stone fortresses, disciplined legions, and the promise, perhaps the illusion of safety. Between the two tens of thousands of Gothic refugees waited desperate, hungry, and terrified. King Fritigern stood among them, watching the river's slow current. Behind him, his people, the Turvings, crowded along the bank in endless lines, men armed with whatever weapons they could still carry, women clutching children wrapped in ragged cloaks, ox carts piled high with bundles of grain tools and family treasures, old men too weak to walk, carried on litters or leaning on staffs. The sound of crying babies mixed with the whinny of horses and the low murmur of prayers in Gothic and Latin. All around them hung the same thought: if Rome says no, we die. The Roman Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, had a decision to make. The Huns were pushing hard from the east. The Goths, though enemies in the past, now begged to be let inside the empire's borders. They offered submission service, even soldiers. Valens saw an opportunity. Why not turn these refugees into allies? Let them farm the underpopulated provinces of Thrace. Let them pay taxes. Let them fight for Rome. And perhaps Valens thought their gratitude would make them loyal, so he gave permission. The Goths could cross the Danube on the condition that they disarm and submit to Roman authority. The emperor's decree sounded merciful, almost visionary Rome as savior of the oppressed. But mercy has a way of souring when filtered through greed. Roman officials on the frontier, especially the generals Lupicinus and Maximus, saw in the migration a chance for personal profit. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of refugees needed food shelter transport. The Roman administrators were unprepared and worse, corrupt. Supplies were diverted and sold at extortionate prices. Food intended for starving families ended up in the bellies of soldiers or on the black market. In some accounts, desperate Goths were forced to trade their children into slavery for a handful of dog meat. Imagine that horror, a mother trembling, handing her child to a Roman merchant, her eyes blank with hunger. The Danube crossing itself was chaos. Roman ferry boats, far too few for the numbers, struggled to keep pace. Some Goths drowned trying to swim. Others were separated from their families. Horses and oxen panicked in the water. The riverbanks became scenes of desperation. Bodies, wagons, and animals tangled together. And through it all, Roman officers barked orders and collected bribes. Every crossing was a transaction. Every life had a price. When the last of the refugees made it across, the situation deteriorated further. The Romans settled the Goths in makeshift camps near Marcianople and Thrace, but provided almost no food. Soldiers extorted them, taking what little they had. The Goths were disarmed, at least in theory, but everyone knew weapons were hidden among them. Roman commanders mocked the Gothic envoys who came to plead for fair treatment. Hunger grew, resentment festered, and fear simmered on both sides. It was a powder keg, and the spark came soon. Lupicinus, the Roman general in charge of Thrace, invited Gothic leaders to a banquet ostensibly to negotiate better conditions. It was a trap. During the feast, his soldiers surrounded the hall, hoping to intimidate or capture the Gothic chiefs. But word spread quickly to the refugee camps. Outside the walls, Gothic warriors, half-starved and furious, began to riot. When Fritigern realized the betrayal, he acted decisively. Slipping away from the feast, He rallied his men and turned the chaos into rebellion. The uprising spread like wildfire. Roman detachments sent to contain the Goths were overwhelmed. Weapons were seized, forts sacked, granaries looted. In a matter of weeks, what had begun as a humanitarian crisis had become a war. Fritigern, once the supplicant, was now the avenger. Imagine the landscape of Thrace, that autumn fields, aflame smoke rising from villages, the thunder of hooves echoing through valleys. Gothic warriors, once refugees, now moved like a tide of vengeance. Roman peasants fled before them. Roman garrisons locked themselves behind walls. The refugees had turned into conquerors, driven not by greed, but by betrayal and rage. Fritigern, though, was no mindless warlord. He tried repeatedly to negotiate, sending envoys to Valens to ask for peace land and fair treatment. But Rome, as ever, hesitated, mistrusted, and misread the moment. The emperor saw not a desperate people, but a rebellion to be crushed. He refused compromise. The Goths would be brought to heel, or so he believed. Among the Roman ranks, soldiers whispered grimly about the barbarian flood. Some mocked it, others were terrified. They had seen the refugees, old men, women, children, and thought them harmless. Now they saw those same people armed and furious, their eyes hollow with hunger and grief. There was something terrible about an army that had nothing left to lose. By the winter of 377, the Goths had carved a path of devastation across Thrace. Roman legions struggled to contain them. Skirmishes went badly. Roman morale plummeted. Supplies dwindled. The empire had welcomed the Goths with promises and deceit, and now it reaped the consequences. And yet beneath the ashes of villages and the sound of clashing steel, something profound was happening. The crossing of the Danube wasn't just a refugee crisis, it was the turning of an age. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on drawing clear lines, civilization on one side, barbarism on the other. But now those lines blurred. The Goths were inside the empire not as conquered subjects, but as an armed nation within a nation. Rome had not been invaded by a foreign army. It had been undone by its own arrogance. Picture that river again, the Danube in twilight. On one shore, the bones of those who never made it across. On the other, smoke rising from burning Roman fields. The water flows quietly between them, indifferent, eternal. The Goths had crossed not just a river, but a point of no return. Ahead lay the great reckoning, the battle that would shake the empire to its core and forever alter the fate of both Rome and the Gothic people. The summer of 378 AD was blistering the plains of Thrace, baked to a brittle gold under an unrelenting sun. Dust hung in the air, like smoke clinging to armor and skin. Both the Roman legions and the Gothic host under Fritigern were exhausted, starved, blistered tents, but the Emperor Valens was determined to finish what he had begun. For 2 long years, he had watched the Gothic refugees turn into raiders, their rebellion spreading like wildfire through his provinces. Now, he would crush them once and for all. Valens commanded a large army, perhaps 40,000 men, hardened veterans of the eastern frontier. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and confident. Scouts reported that the Gothic forces were smaller, disorganized, and low on supplies. Reinforcements from the Western Empire were marching to join him, led by his nephew, the co-emperor Gratian. But Valens was impatient. He wanted the glory of victory for himself. He wanted another title to add to the imperial list, Gothicus Maximus. And so, despite warnings, he decided to attack. The armies met near the city of Adrianople, not far from modern Edirne. It was August 9th, a date that would echo for centuries. The Gothic camp lay on a low hill, surrounded by wagons in a defensive ring. Inside were women, children, the elderly, and all the precious plunder of the refugee-turned-warrior nation. Outside, Fritigern's warriors weighted infantry in the center, cavalry away on the flanks, hidden and mobile. The Romans approached in heavy columns, their armor gleaming in the sun, their banners snapping in the dry wind. The heat was suffocating. Water was scarce. Some men had marched all morning without a drink. As they neared the Gothic position, dust from their own ranks rose and clouded the field. Even before battle was joined, discipline began to crack. Fritigern, watching from the wagon hill, saw his chance. He sent envoys under a flag of truce pretending to seek negotiation. It was a classic delaying tactic, one the Romans should have recognized. The envoys begged for peace, asking only for safe passage and fair treatment. Valens hesitated. His officers debated. Some urged caution, others pressed for immediate attack. Meanwhile, the Gothic cavalry, still absent from the main camp, was racing back across the plains. Then, at the worst possible moment, Roman impatience broke. Whether by misunderstanding or arrogance, a few Roman units advanced prematurely. The skirmish spread. Trumpets blared, orders clashed, and before long, the Roman line was surging uphill into the Gothic camp. The negotiations ended abruptly. Fritigern's envoys galloped back through the dust as Gothic horns roared from behind the wagon circle. The first clashes were brutal, but contained. Roman infantry pushed hard against Gothic warriors, shields locked spears stabbing through the press. For a brief, searing moment, it seemed the empire might prevail by sheer discipline. But then, like a thunderclap on the horizon, the Gothic cavalry arrived. They came sweeping in from the flanks, thousands of horsemen who had been foraging miles away, now charging into battle at full speed. The earth itself seemed to shake. Arrows hissed, lances leveled, and the Roman line began to buckle. Hemmed in by heat exhaustion and chaos, the legions could neither maneuver nor retreat. Dust and screams filled the air. The tight Roman formations, so effective in open terrain, became death traps. Men suffocated, trampled each other, or fell beneath the press of shield and spear. Imagine the scene: sunlight blazing off iron, the din of battle deafening. Gothic cavalry smashing into Roman flanks, hacking through armor with heavy swords. The wagon circle erupting with Gothic women and children, shouting war cries, hurling stones at the enemy. Fritigern's banners rising above the hill, a black eagle on a field of red. Below, the Roman army dissolved into chaos. Valens himself fought bravely, riding among his men, shouting for them to stand firm. But his commands were swallowed by the roar. The imperial guard was cut off. The legions began to rout. And then came the fire. The Goths set the dry grass ablaze, turning the battlefield into an inferno. Flames and smoke rolled across the plain as men burned alive in their armor. The emperor vanished in the chaos, whether slain by sword arrow or fire no one could say. When the battle ended, his body was never found. By nightfall, the Roman army had ceased to exist. 2/3 of it lay dead or dying. Thousands of bodies carpeted the plain, glinting faintly in the fading light. The heat of the day gave way to the stench of blood and smoke. The Goths, exhausted but victorious, wandered among the corpses, gathering spoils rings, weapons, coins, cloaks, anything of value. For them, the victory was almost too great to comprehend. They had annihilated the legions of the East. They had killed an emperor. And they had done it not as invaders, but as refugees betrayed and driven to vengeance. Adrianople was more than a battle, it was a reckoning. News of the disaster spread through the empire like a plague. When the messengers reached Constantinople, the city fell into panic. The citizens feared the Goths would march straight to the capital. Some begged for divine intervention. Others whispered that the gods of Rome had abandoned her. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived through the crisis, wrote simply that the empire suffered a wound that would never heal. And he was right. Adrianople shattered more than an army, it shattered an illusion. Rome was no longer invincible. The idea that disciplined legions could always outmatch barbarian hordes died that day in the dust of Thrace. The balance of power had shifted. From then on, Rome would never again fight the Goths from a position of unquestioned dominance. As the fires of the battlefield died down, Fritigern's warriors gathered under the stars. They sang victory songs in their own tongue, the flicker of campfires casting shadows across their faces. Among them were men who had once begged for Roman bread, who had traded their children for scraps. Now they stood on the corpses of emperors and legionaries alike, free and feared. For Rome, the night of Adrianople was the beginning of a long twilight. For the Goths, it was the dawn of a new and terrible power. When the smoke of Adrianople finally cleared, Rome awoke to a new reality. The empire bruised and bloodied had not fallen, but it had changed. For centuries it had stood as the unchallenged center of the known world, its legions, the iron wall between civilization and chaos. Now that wall had been breached, not by an external invasion, but by its own former allies, by the very refugees it had once sworn to protect. The ghosts of Adrianople lingered in every corner of the empire, whispering that the old order was crumbling. And yet the Romans were nothing if not pragmatic. Even in defeat, they sought ways to turn catastrophe into compromise. The Goths, for their part, were exhausted. They had won a stunning victory, yes, but victory in the field did not feed empty stomachs or house tens of thousands of displaced families. They were still a people without land warriors, with no secure homeland women, and children trailing behind in wagons, living off the grain and livestock of whatever Roman provinces they could raid. For 2 years after the battle, the Gothic armies roamed Thrace almost unchecked. They burned villages, besieged towns, and clashed with Roman garrisons sent in panic to contain them. But the rebellion had no grand plan, no desire to destroy Rome outright. Fritigern wanted what he had always wanted: land food and security for his people. And Rome, weary of constant losses, finally began to listen. In 382 AD, the Empire and the Goths reached an agreement, one of the strangest and most consequential treaties in Roman history. The Goths would be allowed to settle within the Empire's borders south of the Danube in the provinces of Moesia and Thrace. They would not be enslaved or dispersed as conquered peoples traditionally were. Instead, they would remain a distinct nation under their own leaders living on Roman soil, but governed by Gothic law. In return, they would provide soldiers to the empire, fighting as foederati federate allies bound by oath. It was an extraordinary arrangement born of necessity rather than vision. To Roman senators, it was unthinkable, barbarians living inside the empire, not as subjects, but as partners. To the Goths, it was a triumph. They had forced mighty Rome to negotiate, not dictate. They had crossed a river as refugees and now stood as equals in treaty. But this uneasy peace was fragile from the start. The Romans called it federation. The Goths called it survival. Each side interpreted the agreement in its own way. The empire saw the Goths as auxiliaries' tools to refill its depleted armies. The Goths saw themselves as allies' friends, bound by mutual respect. Between those two interpretations lay a chasm that would one day swallow kingdoms. Still, for a time, the arrangement worked. The Goths settled into their new lands, farming, rebuilding, and slowly blending with the local population. Archaeology shows traces of this transformation: Gothic pottery beside Roman amphorae, Gothic brooches buried alongside coins bearing the faces of Roman emperors. It was a cultural fusion, born of war and necessity. Some Goths even rose through Roman ranks. Many enlisted as soldiers serving in frontier units, or even in elite imperial guards. Others became officials, interpreters, or landowners. A few families adopted Roman customs, outright learning Latin, wearing togas, baptizing their children in the Nicene faith instead of the Arian Christianity of their ancestors. Yet most clung fiercely to their traditions, to their assemblies and chiefs, to the stories of the gods and kings who had carried them from Scanza to the Danube. To Roman eyes, the Goths remained both useful and unsettling a people within, but not of the empire. They lived in their own villages, spoke their own tongue, followed their own leaders. They paid no regular taxes, but they did provide warriors, and in an empire constantly short on soldiers, that was enough to buy tolerance. The emperors, who followed Valens, especially Theodosius the Great, saw in them a solution to a deeper problem, a way to strengthen the frontier without draining Roman manpower. Theodosius, ruling the Eastern Empire, played a delicate game. He understood that the age of conquest was over. Rome could no longer subdue every tribe by force. Instead, he used diplomacy, lavish gifts, titles, and religious solidarity to bind the Goths to him. He invited their leaders to court, dined with them, called them brothers in Christ. Theodosius was a shrewd politician and a devout Christian. He saw the Gothic alliance as both a military and a spiritual project. Under him, many Gothic warriors took service in Roman armies, fighting not against the empire, but for it. Yet the alliance was never free of tension. Beneath the polite exchange of oaths, mistrust ran deep. Roman elites muttered that the Goths were becoming too powerful. Gothic leaders bristled at Roman arrogance, their memories of betrayal on the Danube still raw. Cultural misunderstandings festered Roman officials sneering at Gothic barbarism, Gothic warriors mocking Roman decadence. And yet, in this uneasy peace, the Gothic people began to change. Their time within the empire exposed them to Roman cities, Roman laws, and Roman Christianity. They learned to read and write in Latin, to negotiate treaties, to understand politics at the imperial level. Their children grew up bilingual, their leaders savvy in both diplomacy and war. They were still Gothic, yes, but now they knew how Rome worked from the inside. Imagine a Gothic village in Thrace during this time. Roman stone villas stand near Gothic longhouses. Smoke from hearths curls into the twilight. A Roman merchant haggles with a Gothic farmer over a price for grain. Children chase each other through fields, switching effortlessly between Latin and Gothic. In the distance, Roman soldiers train beside Gothic recruits, their shields painted with different emblems, but raised in the same rhythm. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed that coexistence might hold. But empires rarely share power gracefully. The balance that Theodosius built would not last beyond his lifetime. After his death in 395, the unity of Rome itself began to fracture. The empire split again into East and West, each suspicious of the other, each using the Goths as pawns in their struggles. The Federate alliance that had once promised peace would soon become the instrument of Rome's humiliation. For now, though, the Goths rested. They had crossed rivers, survived betrayal, and shattered legions. They had gone from exiles to allies. In the quiet fields of Thrace, amid the hum of plows and the distant chanting of priests, they might have believed they had finally found a home. But fate, as always, had other plans, and a new king was already rising among them, one who would lead his people far beyond the Danube to the very heart of the empire itself. Out of the uneasy calm of the late 4th century rose a man whose name would echo through Roman nightmares for generations, Alaric, son of the Goth servant of Rome, and soon its most formidable enemy. To his people, he was a hero, a man who carried the ancient fire of the Goths within him. To Rome, he would become the barbarian who dared to do the unthinkable. But before the legends and the sack of cities, before he stood at the gates of the eternal city itself, Alaric was something far humbler, a young soldier in the service of the empire he would one day destroy. He was born around 370 AD, likely among the Turvings in the fertile lands of the lower Danube lands granted to the Goths after their treaty with Theodosius. The empire had rebuilt itself after Adrianople, and the Goths had settled uneasily within it, farming and fighting as federates. It was a time of contradictions. Gothic villages shadowed by Roman forts, Gothic warriors paid in Roman coin, Gothic leaders sitting in Roman councils, yet never fully trusted. Alaric grew up in this liminal world, neither fully Roman nor entirely free. He would have heard both languages at home, Gothic tales of ancestral kings, like Bear and Fritigern, and Latin sermons brought by Christian priests. He would have worn the woolen tunic of a Gothic farmer, but he would have learned Roman drill, Roman discipline, Roman ambition. It was a dual inheritance, a blessing and a curse. The boy who listened to elders tell of the northern mists now marched beneath the banners of Rome, his spear at the empire's command. When Emperor Theodosius the Great died in 395, the delicate peace he had forged died with him. The empire was divided once again between his two sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east, and immediately the old rivalries resurfaced. Court factions, generals, and ministers jostled for control. Amid the chaos, the Federate armies those Gothic troops settled within the empire felt abandoned and cheated. They had fought loyally under Theodosius, even helping him crush rival armies. But when the emperor's gold stopped flowing, when promises of land and reward went unfulfilled, resentment boiled over. It was in this tension that Alaric stepped forward. By now, a seasoned warrior, tall, broad-shouldered, and charismatic, he gathered the discontented Gothic federates under his command. He had fought for Rome, and he had seen how Rome treated its allies. The empire had used the Goths as expendable muscle, never equals. For Alaric, it was time to claim what his people were owed. In the spring of 395, Gothic banners rose in revolt once more. Alaric led his troops out of their barracks and into the open countryside of Thrace and Macedonia, looting Roman estates and towns as they went. The rebellion was swift, disciplined, almost surgical. Alaric didn't want wanton destruction. He wanted recognition. He sought titles, land's legitimacy, a formal role within the empire. Rome, predictably, saw only treachery. As his army moved southward, Alaric crossed into Greece, a land already ancient by the time of the Goths. His men swept through the storied cities of classical glory, Corinth, Argos, Sparta, even Athens itself. Temples and forums that had stood for 1,000 years now saw Gothic spears flashing in their streets. Yet Alaric was careful. He spared Athens negotiating tribute rather than bloodshed. This was no mindless raid. It was a campaign with purpose. The Goths demanded what Rome refused to give: acknowledgement and stability. The Eastern Roman court in Constantinople, horrified, finally dispatched its most capable general, Stilicho. Half Roman, half Vandal Stilicho was as cunning as he was ruthless. He understood Alaric's mind better than most. For months, the two armies maneuvered across the rugged terrain of Greece and Illyricum, clashing in a series of indecisive battles. Alaric proved slippery, retreating, before defeat, striking again from unexpected directions. Stilicho cornered him more than once, but Alaric always escaped his army, moving like smoke through the valleys. At last, an unexpected twist came from politics rather than battle. The Eastern court, jealous of Stilicho's growing fame, ordered him to withdraw. Suddenly, Alaric found his greatest enemy gone. The path to negotiation reopened. Constantinople, desperate for peace, offered him what he had always wanted: a title, wealth, and authority. He was named Magister Militum, per Illyricum, master of soldiers, for the province of Illyricum. It was a Roman rank worn by a Gothic king. The empire had tried to tame its enemy by turning him into an official. But for Alaric, the gesture rang hollow. The empire might grant him titles, but not trust. His people still lived in poverty, his soldiers still went unpaid, and his supposed command extended only as far as Rome's convenience allowed. To the Romans, he was a useful barbarian. To his followers, he was a savior, waiting to fulfill their destiny. In his campfires, the air was thick with stories of betrayal by emperors, of broken treaties, of promises that always dissolved in Latin ink. Alaric listened, and the resolve hardened in him. Rome had given him rank, but no respect. It had made him a servant when he sought partnership. And so, as the 5th century dawned, the young Gothic general began to dream of something unthinkable, not service to Rome, but conquest of it. He would not do it for glory alone. He would do it for every Gothic family still wandering the empire's borderlands, for every warrior paid with words instead of gold, for every insult his people had suffered. Alaric's ambition was simple and vast: to carve a permanent home for the Goths, to force Rome to treat them not as guests or mercenaries, but as a nation in their own right. The stage was set. The empire was divided and distracted, ruled by weak emperors and feuding ministers. Alaric had men, horses, and purpose. And somewhere deep within him, perhaps even he could feel the strange pull of destiny, the same restless force that had carried his ancestors out of the northern mists so long ago. The Goths would march again, not as refugees this time, but as an army that had learned every lesson Rome had to offer. The road ahead led westward toward Italy, and toward a reckoning the world would never forget. The winter wind swept across the Adriatic and carried with it the scent of smoke villages burning in Illyricum. Roman villas sacked the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the valleys. The Gothic army was moving again. At its head rode Alaric, calm, deliberate, his cloak snapping in the cold air, eyes fixed toward the distant mountains of Italy. Behind him came his people, thousands of warriors hardened by years of betrayal, families in wagons, priests clutching crosses of carved wood, and children born on the march who had never known peace. They were not marching blindly. They were marching toward the heart of the empire itself. By 401, AD, Rome was no longer the colossus it once had been. The Western Empire ruled now by the boy emperor Honorius. From the safety of Ravenna was fragile, hollowed out by corruption, civil wars, and economic decay. Its legions were thinly spread, its treasury nearly empty. Alaric knew it. He had watched the empire crumble from within, and where others saw decline, he saw opportunity. The pretext for invasion was simple: Rome had failed to fulfill its promises. The Goths had served loyally as federates, fought its wars, guarded its frontiers, and yet they were unpaid, unlanded, unwanted. Every petition Alaric sent to court was ignored, every treaty delayed or denied. The message was clear: the Goths were useful, but not equals. And so, Alaric decided to speak the only language Rome still understood: war. In late 401, the Gothic host descended through the Julian Alps into northern Italy. Their advance was swift and devastating. Town after town fell: Aquileia, Concordia, Cremona, each sacked and stripped of supplies. Panic spread like wildfire. It had been over 600 years since a foreign army had crossed the Alps into Italy. Rome's senators, grown soft from centuries of comfort, could hardly believe the news. Barbarians, they said in Italy, impossible. But the impossible was riding toward them, spear in hand. The empire's defense fell to one man, Stilicho, the half-Vandal general, who had once hunted Alaric across the Balkans. He was now the real power behind the boy emperor Honorius, and though his enemies at court despised him, he was the only Roman commander capable of facing the Goths. Gathering what forces he could, Roman legions, Germanic auxiliaries, and Hunnic mercenaries, Stilicho, marched north to meet the invaders. The first great clash came near Pollentia on Easter Sunday of 402 AD. Imagine the scene: Roman troops forming ranks as church bells echoed faintly across the plains, priests murmuring prayers for divine favor, Gothic cavalry stamping impatiently in the dawn light. Alaric's warriors, fierce and confident, charged first. The Roman lines wavered. Bent almost broke, but Stilicho held fast. At the critical moment, his cavalry counterattacked, slamming into the Gothic flank. The battle raged for hours, dust and blood clouding the field until finally the Gothic line collapsed. For the first time, Alaric tasted defeat. His camp was overrun, his wife and children captured. Roman chroniclers rejoiced, calling it divine vengeance for Adrianople. But even in victory, Stilicho hesitated. He knew better than to destroy the Goths entirely. They were too many, too mobile, too valuable. And so, after a brief pursuit, he offered peace, allowing Alaric to withdraw into the Balkans. It was a cautious, calculated truce, but Alaric was not done. He regrouped, rebuilt, and returned. 2 years later, in 403, he invaded Italy again, striking deeper this time. Stilicho met him once more near Verona. Again, the fighting was brutal. Again, the Goths were repelled. And again, Stilicho chose negotiation over annihilation. To his Roman critics, this was weakness. To Stilicho, it was pragmatism. He understood that destroying the Goths would only open the door to worse enemies beyond the frontier. So the uneasy dance continued: war, negotiation, betrayal, repeat. Alaric was offered new lands, then denied them. Promised payment, then cheated of it. Rome used him when convenient, discarded him when not. The pattern was as old as the Danube. And every time the empire broke its word, the fire in Alaric burned hotter. Meanwhile, the empire itself was fracturing. Stilicho's enemies at court conspired against him, whispering that he was too soft on the barbarians, too ambitious, perhaps even plotting to take the throne. The young emperor, Honorius, weak and paranoid, began to believe it. In 408, Stilicho was accused of treason and executed an act that stunned the army and shattered what little unity remained. When news reached Alaric, he saw his moment. The one Roman capable of restraining him was gone. The empire was headless, divided between jealous generals and frightened bureaucrats. And so once again, the Gothic banners were raised. Alaric called his people to arms, not just warriors this time, but entire families, tribes, and clans. They would march together, not as mercenaries, but as a nation seeking justice. In the autumn of 408, Alaric crossed the Alps for the third time. His army swept into Italy like a tide. Cities that had not seen war since the age of Hannibal now trembled. Alaric did not slaughter wantonly. He demanded negotiation. His terms were simple gold land and recognition of his people's rights. But the Roman Senate balked, torn between fear and pride. Some urged peace, others vengeance. Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, refused to face him at all. So the siege began. The Gothic army encircled the eternal city itself. Roads were cut, aqueducts sabotaged. Inside the walls, famine set in. Grain stores emptied. People ate rats' dogs, even the leather from their sandals. Priests led processions through the streets, praying for divine deliverance. The senators, in desperation, sent envoys to Alaric's camp, where Gothic warriors sat around fires, roasting meat on stolen Roman spits. "What will you take to leave us in peace?" they asked. Alaric, cool and deliberate, replied, "Everything that you call yours." They stared at him in horror. "And what will you leave us?" He smiled. "Your lives." The ransom he eventually demanded was staggering 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, thousands of silk garments, and hides of fine dye. The Senate scraped together what it could, stripping temples of treasure, taxing nobles to the brink of ruin. The payment was made, and Alaric withdrew. For a moment, peace seemed possible, but Rome could not keep even this bargain. New intrigues, new insults, new betrayals followed. And each time, Alaric's patience thinned. The Goths had crossed mountains, bled for emperors, endured broken promises, and still they were treated as beggars at the gate. In 410, A.D. Alaric would march once more, not for ransom this time, but for remembrance. The eternal city, unbreached for 8 centuries, was about to learn that even legends can fall. The year was 410 A.D. For 800 years, the eternal city had stood untouched, its walls scarred by time, but never by invasion. To Romans, the idea that any foreign army might enter its gates was unthinkable. Rome was not merely a city. It was the axis of the world, the symbol of civilization itself. Even as its emperors abandoned it for Ravenna or Constantinople, its senators still spoke of it as if it were divine, a living goddess whose spirit could not die. And yet that summer, the unthinkable came riding from the north under the banner of a Gothic king who had once served in its armies. Alaric had tried peace. He had negotiated, compromised, retreated, and reasoned. But Rome would not listen. The Emperor Honorius hid in Ravenna, surrounded by swamps and bureaucrats, refusing even to meet the Gothic envoys. Every offer, Alaric made payment for his people, land in Illyricum. Recognition of their rights was ignored or insulted. When his final embassy was turned away, with mockery, something inside him hardened. Rome had mistaken patience for weakness. It was time to remind the empire that mercy, too, had limits. In the spring, the Gothic host surrounded the eternal city once more. This time, the siege was absolute. Supply routes were cut, the aqueducts that fed the city's fountains and baths severed. The Tiber ran foul with waste and corpses. Inside the walls, the grandeur of the marble city turned to desperation. The Roman aristocracy, those proud families whose ancestors had conquered the known world, now hoarded scraps of food. Bread riots broke out in the Forum. Mothers buried their infants in secret to keep them from being eaten. The senators, who had once jeered at the barbarian king, now sent envoys begging his favor. Alaric's terms were simple: open the gates, surrender the city, and no unnecessary blood would be shed. Rome's defenders hesitated, paralyzed by pride and fear. Then on the night of August 24th, as a storm rolled over the hills, one of the city's gates, the Salarian Gate, was opened from within. Perhaps by slaves, perhaps by sympathizers, perhaps by pure exhaustion. The Gothic vanguard poured through like water bursting a dam. The city of Romulus and Augustus, of Cicero and Constantine, was taken. Imagine that moment: the crash of iron-shod boots on the stone streets, the shouts of Gothic warriors echoing under the arches, the distant tolling of church bells as smoke rose above the rooftops. For 3 days and nights, Rome belonged to the Goths. And yet, for all the fear the word sack conjures, Alaric kept remarkable restraint. His warriors were ordered to spare the churches, especially St. Peter's and St. Paul's. Anyone who took refuge within their walls was protected. It was a strange sight: terrified Romans, rich and poor alike, streaming into basilicas, clutching icons and candles, while Gothic guards stood outside as sentinels, forbidding bloodshed on sacred ground. The pagan temples fared worse. Many were stripped of their treasures, their idols toppled. The old gods of Rome, silent for centuries, were finally cast down by hands that no longer feared them. But elsewhere, chaos reigned. Palaces were looted, villas burned silver and gold, carted away by the wagon load. Senators were held for ransom. Noblewomen were taken hostage. Yet even among the Goths, there was awe, a sense that they were walking through history itself. Warriors who had been born in wooden huts on the Danube now stared up at marble columns taller than their fathers had ever imagined. Some whispered prayers, others laughter. To them, Rome was not a goddess anymore, but a treasure chest finally cracked open. One story told by later chroniclers captures the strange blend of reverence and ruin. A Gothic soldier entering a house saw a silver bowl gleaming in the candlelight. He reached for it until he noticed a Christian cross engraved on its rim. He paused, murmured a prayer, and left it untouched. The same man later was seen carrying loaves of bread to a group of starving Roman children he found huddled near a church. The sack was brutal, yes, but not without its flickers of humanity. For the Roman world, however, it was trauma beyond measure. News of the city's fall spread faster than any army. In Gaul, in Africa, in Constantinople, people wept openly in the streets. Augustine, in distant Hippo, began writing his City of God to make sense of the catastrophe. Jerome in Bethlehem recorded his horror. The light of the world has been extinguished. Even those who hated Rome's arrogance felt the loss of something larger, the collapse of an idea. If Rome could fall, then what was safe? What was eternal? Alaric, for his part, did not linger. True to his word, after 3 days, he ordered the looting to stop. The Gothic army gathered its spoils, its captives, its wagons, and marched south. His goal was not destruction, but leverage. He dreamed still of founding a Gothic kingdom within the empire's borders, of forging a place where his people could live in peace. To him, the sack of Rome was not an ending, but a bargaining chip. But the empire fractured, and proud would never truly bargain with him. As his army moved down the Italian peninsula toward the port of Cosenza, perhaps hoping to cross into Africa and secure grain for his people, fate intervened. A fever swept the camp. Alaric the Bold, the breaker of Rome, fell ill. Within days, he was dead. The Goths, devastated, refused to let the Romans find his body. According to legend, they diverted the waters of a river, buried their king in its bed, along with treasure and arms, and then killed the slaves who had dug the grave so that no one would ever know the spot. When the waters flowed again, they washed over a secret tomb somewhere beneath the soil of Italy, where the man who had humbled Rome still lies. The sack of Rome was not the end of the Gothic story, but it was the end of an age. The eternal city had been breached. The world's great illusion of Roman invincibility had crumbled. The Goths marched on not as marauders now, but as a people searching for a homeland. They carried with them the gold of Rome, the ghosts of their king, and the knowledge that even the mightiest walls could fall. The year was still 410 AD, when the Gothic army left the smoldering ruins of Rome behind their wagons, creaking under the weight of plunder and memory. For 3 long days they had held the eternal city in their grasp, had walked its marble avenues, opened its treasure vaults, and looked upon statues of gods that no longer answered prayers. And then, as swiftly as they had come, they were gone, marching south into the heart of Italy, the faint echo of their boots fading behind them. Alaric rode at their head, his face unreadable. To his men, he was the king who had broken Rome's spell, the man who had turned centuries of fear into triumph. But for Alaric himself, victory tasted strangely hollow. He had not come to destroy Rome. He had wanted to make peace with it, to build something lasting. Yet peace had eluded him again, slipping through his hands like water. Rome's arrogance, Rome's deceit, Rome's endless promises had left him no choice but to draw the sword. He had won the war, but not the future. The Gothic host rolled onward through the Campagna, through the burned fields and empty villas of southern Italy. The land itself seemed exhausted. Vineyards were overgrown towns, abandoned. Where once Roman legions had marched in perfect order, now came a nation in motion, warriors on horseback, priests carrying relics and crosses, wagons piled high with stolen grain, and children born along the way. The roads of empire had become the highways of exile. Alaric's destination was not conquest, but survival. His people were starving again. Winter was coming, and Italy's fields could not feed them forever. Beyond the southern coast lay Africa, the granary of the empire, rich in grain and fertile soil. If they could cross the sea, Alaric believed the Goths could settle there and thrive. Africa would become the new homeland they had sought since the day they fled the Huns across the Danube. But fate, that silent companion of every Gothic migration, had other plans. When the Gothic army reached the coast near Rhegium, Alaric ordered ships to be gathered. The plan was simple: sail across the narrow strait of Messina land in Sicily, and from there cross to Carthage. But the sea, as it so often does in Gothic stories, turned against them. Storms battered the coast. Ships were wrecked or scattered. The sea swallowed men, horses, wagons, and dreams alike. The survivors dragged themselves back to shore, coughing seawater, staring at the waves as if betrayed by the gods. For Alaric, it was the final blow. The man who had crossed mountains, defeated legions, and humbled emperors now faced an enemy he could not outthink or outfight. As the storms raged, he fell ill, perhaps from fever, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from the sheer weight of destiny. His counselors begged him to rest, but Alaric refused. He had not brought his people this far to die unfinished. Yet within days, his strength failed him. The man who had once commanded nations now lay beneath a tattered tent, his breath shallow, his mind wandering. He called for his most trusted followers. "I have led you across rivers through fire and hunger," he told them softly. "I have broken Rome, but not her chains. You must go on. The Goths must live." His last request was simple and impossible: to be buried in secret where no Roman could ever find him. His men obeyed. According to legend, they diverted the course of the Busento River in Calabria, laboring through the night by torchlight. When the riverbed lay dry, they dug a grave deep in the earth, lined it with treasure, Roman gold, Gothic weapons, the banners of his victories. They placed their king within his sword, laid across his chest, and covered him with stones. Then they released the waters, letting the river flow again over his tomb. When the work was done, the slaves who had dug it were executed to preserve the secret. The river sang over its buried king, and the world never knew the place. So ended Alaric the Bold, the Gothic king, who had marched from the Danube to the heart of Italy, from the dust of defeat to the gates of eternity. He was no mere barbarian warlord, as Roman chroniclers would later sneer, but the living embodiment of a people's restlessness and resilience. Under him, the Goths had ceased to be wanderers. They had become a nation. His death left the army adrift. Leadership passed to his brother-in-law, Athalf, a man of cunning and charm, but of gentler ambition. The warriors mourned their king in silence, their grief mingled with awe. Even as they broke camp and moved north again, the legend of Alaric began to take shape. Around Gothic campfires and in Christian monasteries alike, men would whisper of the river that kept its secret, of the king who had toppled Rome and vanished beneath the water like a ghost. But history, relentless as ever, did not stop to mourn. The Goths still had no homeland. Italy, for all its beauty, could not sustain them. Famine stalked their camps, and Roman armies prowled the borders. Athalf, pragmatic where Alaric had been visionary, looked elsewhere to the rich provinces of Gaul, where chaos and rebellion had torn the empire apart. Perhaps there, amid the ruins of Rome's fading power, the Goths could carve a place of their own. and so they turned their faces north once more. Behind them lay Alaric's secret grave, the echo of his dream drowned beneath a river's current. Before them lay the long roads of Gaul, and the faint flickering hope that the wandering of the Gothic people might one day come to an end. The king who had broken Rome was gone, but the world he shattered was still falling. The river that concealed Alaric's bones flowed on in silence, but his people could not. Grief and hunger drive even the proudest nations forward, and so under the gray skies of the winter of 410, the Gothic wagons began to roll north once more. At their head now rode Athaulf Alaric's brother-in-law, his comrade in arms, and in many ways his opposite. If Alaric had been a hammer, Athaulf was a hand gentler, more patient, but still strong enough to shape destiny. The new king inherited not an empire, but an exhausted people, warriors, weary from decades of marching women and children, thin from famine oxen, staggering beneath the last of their spoils from Rome. The roads they followed through the Apennines were littered with the ghosts of empire-broken aqueducts, weed-choked villas, statues lying face down in the dirt. Everywhere, the grandeur of Rome was fading, and Athaulf saw in that decay both a warning and a possibility. He had known Alaric's dream to secure a homeland within the empire, a Gothic state that could live in peace beside Rome. But after years of war, Athaulf saw that conquest alone would not achieve it. The Goths could defeat Roman armies, yes, but they could not replace Roman civilization. At first, he is said to have confessed. Later, I longed to erase the Roman name and build a Gothic world in its place. But experience taught me that the Goths could not live without Roman law. So he dreamed, instead of union rather than destruction, a partnership of Gothic strength and Roman order of barbarian vigor, guided by ancient wisdom. It was an impossible dream, perhaps, but a noble one, and for a brief, flickering moment, it almost came true. By 412, the Goths had crossed the Alps into Gaul. The once mighty Roman provinces there were in chaos. Usurpers fought over the imperial throne. Germanic tribes, the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi ravaged the countryside. Cities fell silent beneath the smoke. To Athaulf, Gaul was not a battlefield, but a canvas, a place where he might finally paint the outline of a new Gothic Roman order. He made his base in southern Gaul, first near Narbonne, then Toulouse. The cities frightened, but pragmatic opened their gates. The Goths brought discipline and protection where Rome no longer could. Fields where replanted trade cautiously resumed. The Goths were still foreign, still feared, but under Athaulf's leadership, they behaved more like settlers than conquerors. And then amid this fragile calm came one of the strangest and most symbolic unions in history. Athaulf married Galla Placidia, sister of the Emperor Honorius. Placidia had been captured during the sack of Rome 2 years before, a royal hostage spirited away among the Gothic wagons. But she was no frail prize. Daughter of the great Theodosius, raised in palaces and battle camps alike, she possessed a sharp mind and an indomitable will. The Gothic king and the Roman princess were by all accounts an unlikely pair, he tall and rugged, she proud and cultivated. And yet between them bloomed something that was both personal and political, a marriage of convenience perhaps, but also of shared vision. Their wedding, held in Narbonne around 414 AD, was a spectacle of contradictions. Gothic warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with Roman courtiers. Latin hymns mingled with the rough cadence of Gothic chants. Placidia, veiled in silk, was crowned with a wreath of flowers rather than imperial jewels. Athaulf wore no diadem, only a cloak clasped with a brooch taken from a Roman general years before. It was in its way the symbolic union of two worlds, the dying Rome and the restless Gothic nation. For a moment, it seemed to work. The Gothic army now encamped across southern Gaul. acted as peacekeepers more than plunderers. Placidia advised her husband in matters of Roman protocol and diplomacy, teaching him how to negotiate with the imperial court. Athalf spoke of himself not as the enemy of Rome, but as her protector. I wish he reportedly told his followers to restore the Roman name with Gothic vigor to make myself and my people the instruments of her renewal. But history rarely rewards idealists. Supplies grew scarce, and the empire still ruled by the suspicious and inept Honorius refused to honor agreements. Famine struck. Roman officials in nearby provinces conspired to turn the local populations against their Gothic allies. Even among Athalf's own followers, patience wore thin. Some wanted to continue Alaric's path of conquest. Others whispered that their king had grown soft under the influence of his Roman wife. Then tragedy struck their fragile household. Placidia gave birth to a son whom they named Theodosius in honor of her father, the last great emperor who had united the empire. For a brief time, hope returned. The child symbolized the future Athalf had dreamed of, the blood of Rome and the blood of the Goths flowing in one heir. But the infant died within a year, and with him, the dream of union seemed to die as well. The tiny body was buried in a silver coffin beneath the walls of Barcelona, a city not yet Gothic, not yet Roman, just a midpoint between worlds. Soon after fate struck again. In 415, Athalf was assassinated by one of his own men while bathing in his stables, stabbed by a disgruntled servant seeking revenge for a personal wrong. The killer was executed, but the damage was done. The fragile experiment of peace between Rome and the Goths collapsed overnight. Galla Placidia, now a widow in enemy lands, was captured and handed over to the Romans. She would one day become the most powerful woman in the Western Empire, regent empress, mother of emperors, but that is another tale. As for the Goths, they once again found themselves leaderless and adrift. The kings that followed Athalf Sigaric briefly, then Wallia, were warriors rather than dreamers. They understood what Athalf had not, that Rome would never see the Goths as equals. And so, under Wallia, the Goths returned to the old logic of steel and soil. They negotiated new terms, fought fresh battles, and began to carve out the foundation of what would one day become the Visigothic kingdom. But even as they turned to the sword once more, some remembered the man who had tried another path, the king who dreamed of building not on ruins, but on reconciliation. Perhaps in some quiet corner of Gaul, an old Gothic soldier once whispered by the fire, "We buried Alaric in the river, but Athalf we buried in our hearts." One sought to conquer Rome, the other sought to heal her. Two brothers of destiny, two visions of history, and between them, the slow, inevitable birth of medieval Europe. The dream of peace had died with Athalf, but the Gothic people endured. They always did. From the northern mists of Scanza to the shores of Italy, from the ruins of Rome to the fields of Gaul, they had wandered for centuries, driven by hunger, faith, pride, and the simple will to survive. Now at last, that wandering began to find shape. What Alaric had sought through conquest, and Athalf through unity, their successor, Wallia, would secure through sheer pragmatism. Wallia was no visionary. He was a soldier, a realist, a man tempered by decades of blood and betrayal. When he became king in 415, the Gothic nation was again on the brink of collapse. Famine stalked their camps. Roman armies harried them from the north. The Vandals and Alans pressed from the south. The grand dreams of a Gothic Roman kingdom had dissolved into the same old struggle for bread and safety. So Wallia did what Gothic kings always did best: he adapted. The empire, desperate as ever, came to him. The general Constantius, who now ruled in the name of Emperor Honorius, needed soldiers, Gaul and Hispania were in chaos, torn apart by rival barbarian tribes. The Romans lacked the manpower to reclaim them. The Goths, hungry and battle-hardened, were the perfect tool. And so, the two sides struck a bargain. In 416, Wallia agreed to fight for Rome once more. In return, the empire promised food, gold, and most importantly, land. True to his word, Wallia led the Gothic armies against the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, who had ravaged Hispania. It was a brutal campaign. The Goths fought not as raiders, but as professionals, executing Rome's enemies with ruthless efficiency. The Vandals were crushed, their king slain. The Alans, those fierce steppe riders who had once terrified Europe, were nearly annihilated. For the first time in decades, the Roman banners flew again over Spanish cities, but it was Gothic steel that had raised them. When the fighting was done, the empire kept its word, at least this time. In 418, the Goths were granted land in Aquitaine, the lush region of southwestern Gaul, stretching from Toulouse to Bordeaux. It was not a gift, nor a colony, nor even a true vassal state. It was something new, something the world had not yet seen, a kingdom within an empire. The Romans called it the foedus of 418. The Goths called it home. Imagine that first spring in Aquitaine. After years of hunger, Gothic farmers plowed their own fields. Smoke rose from hearths, not built for war, but for warmth. Children who had been born in wagons learned to walk on solid ground. For the first time in living memory, the Gothic people were not marching, they were planting. Toulouse became their center, a city reborn under Gothic banners. There, Roman walls stood beside wooden halls. Latin speech mingled with the Gothic tongue. Bishops debated theology in one quarter, while blacksmiths forged swords in another. It was a strange harmony, part Roman, part Gothic, all new. The Roman world, however, watched uneasily. To many senators, the settlement was an outrage. Barbarians living on Roman land. Barbarians commanding Roman armies. It was unthinkable. Yet necessity had made the unthinkable real. The empire could no longer defend itself without the barbarians it had once despised. And so the Goths, those outsiders, became the keepers of Roman order in the West. Wallia died not long after his great settlement, but his achievement outlived him. His successors, Theodoric II, Euric, would transform that fragile agreement into a dynasty. Over the next half-century, the Visigoths would grow in strength, expanding their realm until it stretched from the Loire in Gaul to the Ebro in Spain. The old Roman provinces became the bones of a new kingdom, Gothic in blood, but Roman in mind. It was during this time that a new identity solidified. The word Goth no longer meant wanderer. It meant ruler. Their leaders adopted Roman titles. Their scribes wrote in Latin. Their bishops debated Christian doctrine with imperial theologians. Yet beneath the robes and diadems, they never forgot who they were. Their kings were still chosen by warriors. Their assemblies still gathered under open skies. Their songs still spoke of Alaric and Atholf, of rivers crossed and cities conquered. One could walk through Toulouse in the mid-5th century and see history itself braided into daily life. A Roman noblewoman in silk bargaining with a Gothic trader over amphorae of wine. A Gothic soldier kissing the cross before riding out to battle against the Franks. Children of both peoples playing in the shadow of an old Roman aqueduct. The empire's corpse had not yet cooled, and yet something new, half barbarian, half civilized, was stirring in its place. And perhaps the strangest thing of all, Rome had begun to imitate the Goths as much as the Goths had once imitated Rome. Emperors now relied on barbarian generals, spoke of alliances rather than dominion, wore Gothic furs at court. The lines between conqueror and conquered blurred until they were meaningless. The Goths had not destroyed Rome. They had become Rome's heirs. By mid-century, their kingdom in Gaul was so strong that even emperors deferred to it. Gothic kings issued their own laws, minted their own coins, and commanded armies that no Roman general could challenge. When the Vandals seized North Africa, when Attila the Hun swept across Europe, it was Gothic swords that stood between chaos and the last remnants of civilization. From the ashes of empire, a new order had risen, born of migration, shaped by war, baptized by faith. The Visigothic kingdom would not endure forever. No kingdom does. But it marked the turning of an age, the moment when the barbarian became the builder, when the invader became the heir. In Toulouse, the Gothic banners fluttered over Roman walls, and for the first time in centuries, the long wandering of a northern people seemed at last to have found its rest. Or so they thought. By the mid-5th century, the Visigoths had transformed from a wandering nation into a settled power. The fields of Aquitaine, once Roman estates, now yielded harvests for Gothic tables. Their horses grazed on Gallic meadows instead of steppe grass. Their kings ruled from palaces rather than camps, and their law was written not in the dust of conquest, but in ink and parchment. For the first time in their long and turbulent history, the Goths had not only survived, they had prospered. In Toulouse, their capital, the fusion of worlds was almost tangible. Roman mosaics glittered under Gothic wooden beams. Latin inscriptions adorned halls where warriors once drank from horn cups. Senators and chieftains dined together, sharing wine and cautious conversation. The air was thick with contradiction, a Gothic kingdom wearing Roman skin. At the heart of this transformation stood King Theodoric, Wallia's successor, a warrior philosopher whose reign from 418 to 451 would bring the Visigoths into the center of European history. Theodoric was no barbarian raider. He saw himself as a Roman statesman, one with Gothic muscles and a Roman mind. He maintained treaties, issued laws, and corresponded with imperial courts. Yet when diplomacy failed, he fought with the same ferocity that had carried his people across half the world. His greatest test came with the arrival of a new storm on the horizon, Attila the Hun. The Huns, those horsemen from the endless east, had once driven the Goths from their homeland beyond the Danube. Now, decades later, they returned not as shadows in rumor, but as the living terror of Europe. Attila's armies burned their way through Gaul in 451, leaving cities like Metz-Reims and Troy in ashes. The Western Empire, under its last capable general, Flavius Aetius, scrambled to assemble a coalition. Rome alone could not stop the Huns, but perhaps Rome and her former enemies together could. And so, the Visigoths marched once more under Theodoric's banner. From Toulouse came tens of thousands of warriors' men whose grandfathers had sacked Rome, now fighting to defend it. They joined the Romans, the Franks, the Burgundians, even remnants of Alans and Armoricans. It was an army not of one nation, but of many an alliance born of desperation. The two forces met near the Catalonian plains, not far from modern Chalons, in one of the most legendary battles of the ancient world. The chroniclers would later call it the Battle of the Nations, a struggle so vast that its dust turned the sky red. Picture the scene: the Gothic cavalry arrayed beside Roman legions, their shields marked not with eagles, but with the black sigil of their kings. Across the plain, Attila's horde shimmered like a mirage, thousands of horsemen bows, glinting their camp a forest of banners. The wind carried the eerie music of their horns, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. When the fighting began, it was like the collision of worlds. The Huns charged again and again, their arrows darkening the air. Roman infantry held grimly shields, locking like iron walls. The Goths, fighting beside them, countercharged with spears and swords. their war cries rising over the thunder of hooves. In the chaos, King Theodoric led from the front. He was old by then, nearly 70, but his courage never dulled. Mounted on a white horse, he rode into the thick of the melee, urging his men to stand firm. This day, he shouted, "The Goths, repay the debt of the Danube." It was a strange moment of history's symmetry, the descendants of those who once fled the Huns, now avenging that flight on the same foe. The battle raged until dusk. When it ended, the plains were soaked in blood. Attila's army was shattered, though not destroyed. His tent stood surrounded by the corpses of his warriors, the scourge of God trapped and humiliated. Rome was saved by Goths. But victory came at a price. Theodoric lay dead on the field, trampled beneath the hooves of friend and foe alike. His body was borne from the battlefield by his sons, and the warriors who had followed him for decades wept openly. They had won immortality, but lost their king. In death, Theodoric became a legend. To later generations, he was the Gothic Arthur, the wise king who had united tribes, fought tyranny, and died defending a greater cause. His sons carried on his work, turning the federation of tribes into something more enduring, a true kingdom. After the battle, the Visigoths emerged not as Rome's vassals, but as her protectors, and increasingly her replacements. The Western Empire staggered unhallowed and weak, while the Visigoths expanded south into Hispania. Rome's decay was the Goths' opportunity. City by city, province by province, they filled the vacuum. The foederati had become sovereigns. Over the next decades, under kings like Theodoric II and Euric, the Visigothic realm blossomed. They codified their laws in the Codex Euricianus, one of the first written legal systems in post-Roman Europe. Latin remained the language of administration, but Gothic pride colored every decision. Bishops and warriors shared counsel. Scholars copied scripture in both Gothic and Latin script. The kingdom's heart lay in Toulouse, but its pulse reached all the way into Hispania, where new cities began to bear Gothic names. For a brief golden generation, it seemed as though the dream had come true. The Goths had not destroyed civilization, they had rebuilt it. Their halls were filled with music, their markets with trade. Roman poets wrote verses in their courts. Gothic nobles sent their sons to be educated by Latin tutors. Christianity flourished, though still under the Arian creed, setting them apart from their Nicene neighbors. Yet even this difference gave them identity, a faith that was theirs, a symbol of independence within a world of decaying empires. It was not a perfect peace. No peace born of conquest ever is, but it was stability. And that was something the Goths had not known for 500 years. A traveler passing through their lands around the year 460 might have found it hard to tell where Rome ended and the Visigothic kingdom began. The roads were still Roman, the towns still Latin, the laws still drawn from imperial precedent. But listen closely, and you'd hear the difference: a new language in the marketplaces, a rougher accent in the courts, a people who carried themselves with a quiet, unshakable pride. For the first time, the Goths were not a storm battering civilization's gates. They were its new guardians, the heirs of both sword and scroll. The age of migration was over. The age of kingdoms had begun. By the middle of the 5th century, the Gothic world had shifted again. The empire that had once enslaved and scorned them was now a shadow of itself, its emperors figureheads, its armies thin and mercenary, its cities crumbling into quiet decay. The Visigoths, meanwhile, had become what Rome no longer could be: stable, organized, powerful. Their kings ruled not from tents or war camps, but from palaces in Toulouse, dispensing justice beneath the same marble arches that had once echoed with Roman law. Yet Toulouse, for all its splendor, was never meant to be the end of their journey. It was a beginning a chrysalis. The Gothic heart was still restless. In Gaul, the Visigoths had thrived, but they were not alone. Other peoples, the Franks to the north, the Burgundians to the east, the remnants of Romans clinging to the south, eyed the same fertile lands. It was a delicate balance of power, one that depended on diplomacy, marriages, and the shifting loyalties of generals. And beyond the Pyrenees lay Hispania, the jewel of the old empire, rich, fertile, and fractured among warlords. To a people who had spent generations seeking a true homeland, Hispania shimmered like a promise. That promise would be fulfilled by a king named Euric, the most ambitious and calculating ruler the Goths had yet produced. Euric, who reigned from 466 to 484, was no mere soldier king. He was a statesman, a lawgiver, a man of ruthless intelligence. He had watched the fragile peace between Goth and Roman collapse and decided that coexistence was a lie. The empire was dead. It just didn't know it yet. The Goths, he believed, were not Rome's children. They were her heirs. And so, Euric set about claiming the inheritance. His first act was to end the illusion of submission. No more treaties. No more federate agreements. The Goths were not vassals. They were sovereigns. In 469, he formally broke with Rome, declaring independence in everything but name. Roman officials in his territory were expelled or replaced by Gothic ones. Latin bureaucrats found themselves answering to warriors who spoke with northern accents but wrote in perfect legal Latin. Then came the expansion. Euric's armies swept south across the Pyrenees into the fertile valleys of the Ebro and the plains of Andalusia. The local Roman governors, long cut off from imperial aid, could do little but surrender. City after city opened its gates. The Goths entered not as marauders, but as conquerors. With purpose, they came to rule, not destroy. In one campaign after another, Euric transformed the map of the western Mediterranean. His kingdom stretched from the Loire River in Gaul to the southernmost coasts of Hispania. It was a realm vast enough to rival what was left of the Western Roman Empire itself. From the Atlantic to the Rhone, from the Pyrenees to the Sierra Nevada, the Gothic banners flew over lands once governed by legates of Caesar. Toulouse remained the political heart of this kingdom, but Hispania was its soul. The land suited them mountain and plain wild and fertile old yet unconquered. The Romans had tamed it with roads and cities. The Goths now gave it new life. And under Euric, the Visigothic kingdom began to look not like an occupation, but a civilization. He issued the Codex Euricianus, one of the earliest post-Roman law codes, blending imperial jurisprudence with Gothic custom. It covered everything, from property rights to murder, from inheritance to slavery. Written in Latin and distributed by royal scribes, it was both an assertion of power and a statement of continuity. The Goths were not destroying Rome's legal tradition. They were continuing it in their own image. Religion, however, remained a point of fracture. The Goths were Arians, followers of a creed that viewed Christ as divine but subordinate to God the Father, a belief the Nicene Church had long condemned as heresy. To the Catholic Romans, who still lived in Gothic lands, their ruler's faith was both alien and unsettling. Churches remained divided, priests debated bitterly, and bishops in Gaul and Hispania eyed their new kings with suspicion. Yet Euric, pragmatic as ever, understood the value of tolerance. He allowed both faiths to exist uneasily, side by side. Imagine life in his kingdom, a Roman villa outside Narbonne, its mosaic floors depicting gods long forgotten, now occupied by a Gothic noble in wool and iron. His children speak Gothic at home, but their tutors teach them Latin. In the local market, Roman merchants sell olive oil to Gothic farmers, who pay in coins bearing the face of their own king. In the churches, Latin hymns mingle with Gothic prayers. It is not empire as Rome knew it, nor barbarism as it once feared it is something new, something in between. Under Euric, the Visigoths reached their zenith. For the first time, they ruled not as outsiders, but as natives masters of a kingdom that was both ancient and newborn. Even the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople had to acknowledge their dominance. When envoys came from the East, they no longer spoke of alliances or agreements. They addressed Euric as what he was, a king among kings. But every golden age carries the seeds of its decline. The same strength that built the Visigothic kingdom, its fierce independence, its separation from Roman orthodoxy, would one day isolate it. Across the Pyrenees, a new power was stirring the Franks, led by a warlord named Clovis, whose conversion to Nicene Christianity would win him both divine favor and the loyalty of Roman subjects. The future was already rumbling like distant thunder, for now, though, the Visigothic kingdom stood at its height. A people who had once been exiles and raiders were now lawgivers and rulers. They had wandered across continents, crossed oceans of blood and betrayal, and at last found a land to call their own. The Gothic kings sat upon thrones carved from Roman marble, their crowns fashioned from the spoils of empire, their scepters gilded with the dust of history. The age of the Goths had begun to shine, and like all great ages, it would not last. By the late 5th century, the Visigothic kingdom seemed unshakable. Its kings ruled from Toulouse with the confidence of men who believed they had outlasted the empire itself. Rome had crumbled into fragments, its emperors mere ghosts remembered in books, while Gothic banners flew proudly from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic. Their laws were written. Their armies seasoned, their wealth drawn from both Gallic vineyards and Spanish mines. For the first time in their long wandering history, the Goths were not fighting for survival. They were defending what was theirs. But power has a way of drawing new storms. Across the northern plains of Gaul, another Germanic tribe was rising. The Franks, a once fragmented people, now unified under the cunning and ambition of one man, Clovis. Young, brutal, and brilliant Clovis was everything Euric had been, but with a weapon even the Gothic kings had never dared wield: faith. In 496, Clovis converted to Nicene Christianity, the faith of Rome itself. It was a masterstroke of politics and symbolism. While the Visigoths clung to their Arian creed, suspiciously heretical in the eyes of Catholic Romans, Clovis embraced the Church of the West. Priests hailed him as the new Constantine. Bishops called him the savior of Gaul. Roman cities that had tolerated Gothic rule out of fear now looked north to the Franks with hope. In one swift baptism, Clovis turned religion into revolution. By the time Euric's son, Alaric II, took the throne, the Franks were no longer distant rivals. They were the enemy at the gates. Alaric II was a gentler soul than his father, more scholar than warrior. He loved Roman law, Roman learning, Roman order. He married Theodegotha, daughter of Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king, who ruled Italy and dreamed of a Gothic alliance spanning all of Western Europe. He issued the Breviarium Alaricianum, a codification of Roman law meant to govern his Roman subjects fairly. His court was cultured, even elegant. Poets, bishops, and philosophers gathered there. In Toulouse, one could hear the debates of bishops, the laughter of courtiers, and the ring of swordsmiths in the same breath. But outside the walls, the Franks were gathering. In 507, Clovis launched his campaign, part holy war, part conquest. He declared that he came to free the Catholic Romans from the heretical yoke of Arian rule. Bishops blessed his army. Churches opened their treasuries to fund the campaign. Behind his ranks marched both soldiers and priests' banners embroidered with crosses fluttering over the armored ranks. The Franks moved south with righteous fury, and Gaul erupted into war once again. Alaric II rode out to meet him. Near Vouillé, in the heart of western Gaul, the two kings faced one another, one crowned by faith, the other by heritage. It was in many ways the last battle of Rome's shadow, Arian versus Catholic Gothic discipline versus Frankish zeal. The chronicles tell us the clash was fierce and confused. The Gothic cavalry charged again and again, their long spears breaking Frankish lines, only for Clovis's infantry to close ranks, hacking with axes and swords. Dust and blood filled the spring air. In the midst of the melee, Alaric II, surrounded by his bodyguards, was struck down, some say, by Clovis himself. When the king fell, the Gothic army broke. Toulouse, the proud capital of the Visigoths, was overrun soon after. Its treasures accumulated since Alaric's sack of Rome were carried north by the victors. Among them, legend says, was the tunic of Saint Martin, the holy relic that would later give its name to the Frankish king's chapel at Tours. The once glittering Gothic city became a spoil of war, its marble halls echoing with the language of its conquerors. The Visigothic dream in Gaul was over, but not the Gothic people. In the chaos that followed, survivors fled south across the Pyrenees, carrying what they could: books, relics, children memories. The Pyrenees, once the border of their kingdom, became its last refuge. There in the valleys of Hispania, a new capital rose: Toledo. From that city, the Visigoths would rebuild what they had lost. The fields of Gaul were gone, but the plains of Spain were rich. The vineyards of Bordeaux were ashes, but the olive groves of Andalusia waited. They had lost a king, but not their purpose. As for the Franks, they rejoiced. Clovis returned north, triumphant, hailed by bishops as a new Caesar. The church anointed him protector of Catholic Gaul. The world had turned Rome's faith, now armed barbarians against other barbarians. In Toulouse, the ruins of the Gothic palace stood for centuries as a quiet reminder, a testament to how quickly triumph turns to dust. The Roman chroniclers wrote that the fall of the Visigoths in Gaul was divine justice for their heresy. Yet one might also say it was the old Roman story, repeating itself once more: empire devoured by ambition, faith turned into politics, and the sword deciding what the law could not. Still beyond the mountains, the Goths endured. They had lost half their kingdom, but gained something rarer: wisdom. No longer the restless wanderers of the steppe, they were now the rulers of Iberia, the masters of a new chapter in Europe's making. And as they built new walls around Toledo and set down new laws, one thing became clear: the age of Gothic kings was not yet over. It had merely changed its throne. The fall of Toulouse might have marked the end of the Visigoths in Gaul, but it was not the end of their story. Far from it. Across the Pyrenees, under the warm sun of Hispania, a new chapter began. From ruin and exile, the Goths forged not a remnant, but a rebirth. By the mid-6th century, the Gothic people, hardened by centuries of migration, war, and adaptation, had found their last and greatest home. The hills of central Spain rose before them like a natural fortress crowned by the city of Toledo. It was an ancient place perched above the river Tagus, where Roman stones still gleamed beneath Gothic banners. From its walls, one could see the plains stretching for miles, and on clear mornings, the faint blue silhouette of mountains at the horizon. It was here that the wandering nation would finally stop. Under the rule of Leovigild Remy 568-586, the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo reached its peak. Leovigild was a man of contradictions, a ruthless soldier and a careful reformer, a warrior king draped in imperial purple. He sought not only to unite his realm, but to elevate it to the level of the old empire whose mantle it had silently inherited. He rebuilt cities, repaired aqueducts, and minted coins bearing his own likeness and unmistakably Roman gesture. He wore a golden diadem and sat on a throne patterned after imperial models. Even his laws were Roman in style, though Gothic in spirit. He extended the Codex Iuricianus, merging Roman legal precision with Gothic custom into what would later become the Liber Judiciorum, the Book of Judgments, one of the great legal codes of the early Middle Ages. But Leovigild's vision went beyond administration. His true ambition was unity, political, cultural, and religious. Hispania, though peaceful on the surface, was divided by faith. The Goths were still Arians, while the majority of their Roman subjects were Catholic. The divide was not merely theological, it was social. To the Catholics, their Arian rulers were still outsiders, polite conquerors, but conquerors nonetheless. To the Goths, Catholicism smelled of Roman submission, a betrayal of their identity. Leovigild sought to bridge that divide, but in his own way. He tried persuasion first, then pressure, then force. He convened synods of Arian bishops to refine their creed, hoping to bring it closer to Catholic belief, without abandoning Gothic independence. He dreamed of a single church for a single kingdom under his authority. But unity, as always, came at a price. His own son, Hermenegild, married to a Catholic princess from Gaul, converted secretly to Catholicism, and rebelled against his father. It was both a family tragedy and a religious war. Leovigild besieged his son's strongholds, capturing Seville and Córdoba after brutal fighting. Hermenegild was eventually taken prisoner, and when he refused to renounce his new faith, he was executed reportedly by his father's order. The story would later become legend. To the Catholic Church, Hermenegild was a martyr, the prince who died for true faith. To Gothic chroniclers, he was a fool who brought civil war into a time of greatness. To history, he was the spark that would change the Gothic world forever. For when Leovigild died in 586, the crown passed to his surviving son, Reccared. And Reccared did what his father could not. He united his people, not by force, but by faith. In 589, at the Third Council of Toledo, Reccared publicly renounced Arianism and embraced Catholicism. Bishops, nobles, and warriors gathered in the city's great basilica. As the king stood before them, tall and solemn, his crown gleaming in the candlelight. When he declared that the Goths and Romans are now one people under one God, the hall erupted in chants of Gloria Deo. It was a symbolic act, but one with immense consequences. For the first time, the divide that had haunted Gothic rule dissolved. The Church, once their wary critic, now became their partner. Roman and Goth prayed side by side. The fusion that Athalf had dreamed of 2 centuries before the union of Gothic strength and Roman order was finally realized in spirit, if not in name. Under the Catholic Visigothic kings, Toledo blossomed. The city became not just a royal seat, but a center of learning and law. Councils of bishops convened there regularly, shaping doctrine and advising the crown. The Liber Judiciorum was expanded and refined, laying the foundation for Iberian legal tradition for centuries to come. Latin was the language of state Gothic, the blood in its veins. Picture Toledo at its height, narrow streets winding up toward the royal palace, workshops buzzing with goldsmiths and scribes, markets filled with voices speaking Latin Gothic, and even Arabic from distant traders. From the cathedral tower, bells rang across the valley, mingling with the sound of the Tagus below. In the royal hall, the king presided over councils of bishops and nobles, his golden cloak trimmed with fur, his scepter resting beside scrolls of law. The barbarians of legend had become administrators, scholars, and patrons of the arts. The Visigothic kingdom was no longer a guest within the empire, it was the empire's heir. For over a century, their rule brought relative peace to Iberia. Roads were kept in repair, justice administered, and scholarship nurtured. The great bishops of Toledo, like Isidore of Seville, would later preserve what was left of classical knowledge, writing encyclopedias that carried Roman wisdom through the coming dark. The dream that began with Alaric's restless march had matured into a civilization. And yet, even as the bells of Toledo rang out over a united kingdom, shadows gathered once more at the edges of Europe. Across the narrow sea, in the deserts of Arabia, a new faith was stirring, one that would spread with a speed and fervor the world had never seen. Within a century, it would sweep across North Africa, cross the straits, and fall upon Spain like another storm from the east. But for now, the Gothic kings reigned in quiet grandeur, believing that the age of wandering was over forever. It was not. The last century of the Visigothic kingdom unfolded like the slow fading of a long sunset, brilliant, dignified, but shadowed by the coming night. From the golden halls of Toledo, their kings ruled over a land that was orderly, cultured, and proud. Yet beneath the gilded calm, old fractures remained, religious tensions, barely healed noble rivalries, barely contained, and the complacency of a people who had forgotten what storms could come from the east. The conversion of record to Catholicism in 589 had united the Goths and Romans in faith, but not always in loyalty. The church grew powerful, its bishops wielding influence not just in the pulpit, but in the council chambers of the palace. Every new king had to secure approval from the clergy, and every council of bishops shaped policy as much as the crown. The partnership that once bound throne and altar began to blur, each watching the other warily. Still, the kingdom flourished. Under kings like Sigebut and Receswinth, the Visigothic state reached a level of sophistication unmatched in post-Roman Europe. The Liber Judiciorum, that great book of Gothic law, was finalized, applying equally to Goths and Hispano-Romans alike. For the first time, there was no legal distinction between the conqueror and the conquered. The people of Hispania were one nation under one law. To scholars of the future, that moment would seem miraculous. A barbarian people who had once crossed rivers as refugees, now governing through codified justice and learned debate. And yet, for all its brilliance, this unity was fragile. The kingdom had lost the raw vigor that once carried it across continents. It had grown cautious, bureaucratic, self-satisfied. Its armies were smaller, its nobles wealthier, its kings more entangled in court intrigues than in visions of destiny. The shadow of that complacency first appeared in 672, when Wamba came to the throne. Wamba was an old soldier, a man who wore the scars of his youth like medals, and he tried to rekindle the discipline of his forefathers. His coronation was said to have been reluctant. He was reportedly forced to accept the crown while still half-dazed from a wound the diadem pressed upon his head before he could refuse. Yet once king, he ruled with the fire of an ancestor reborn. He reformed the army, punished corruption, and restored order to rebellious provinces. When the Basques in the northern mountains rose against Gothic rule, Wamba personally led the campaign to crush them, marching at the head of his soldiers well into his 70s. His victories brought brief glory, but also exposed how thin and brittle the kingdom's strength had become. Every frontier needed guarding. Every rebellion hinted that the center was loosening. After Wamba's death, decline quickened. The nobility, rich and restless, began to treat kingship as a prize rather than an institution. Councils in Toledo turned into arenas of intrigue. Bishops played politics as deftly as warriors once played war. Rival factions schemed dethroned, blinded, or assassinated kings in dizzying succession. The very law that had once unified the kingdom now bound it in red tape paralyzing swift action. And beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, history was stirring again. In 711 AD, word came to Toledo of strange ships crossing from North Africa, light swift vessels carrying warriors who fought under a single god and a single banner. They were Moors, Arabs, and Berbers united under the new faith of Islam. Only a generation earlier, their armies had swept across Persia, Syria, and Egypt. Now, they stood on the shores of Hispania. At first, the Gothic court barely reacted. The king Roderick had only recently seized the throne after a bloody civil dispute. Half the nobles refused to recognize him. Some whispered that the invasion was no more than a border raid. Others believed it divine punishment for Roderick's usurpation. Few realized the storm that was about to break. In July of that year, the two forces met near the Guadalete River in southern Spain. The Gothic army was large but divided its nobles, squabbling its commanders distrustful. The Moors were fewer, but united, swift, and inspired by faith. The battle was short and disastrous. Roderick's lines broke. His soldiers fled. The king himself was lost, his body never found. The defeat at Guadalete was more than a military collapse. It was the unraveling of a civilization. Within a year, the Moorish armies swept through Andalusia. Within 5, they captured Toledo itself. The proud capital of the Gothic world fell without the siege that had once destroyed Rome. The city's gates were opened by factions who saw more to gain from surrender than from resistance. The Gothic kingdom was gone. And yet the Goths themselves did not vanish. In the northern mountains, the rugged hills of Asturias and Cantabria, small bands of nobles and peasants held out. Among them was a minor nobleman named Pelayo, who would rally the survivors and spark a slow, defiant resistance that would one day be called La Reconquista. Even in defeat, the Gothic flame refused to die. In a way, it had come full circle. The people who had once crossed the Danube as refugees were now refugees again, clinging to the edges of empire, waiting for the right moment to rise. History, it seemed, had placed them back where they began, on the border between loss and legend. Imagine the ruins of Toledo in those first years after the conquest, the cathedral silent, the royal palace dark, the air thick with dust and memory. The Moorish soldiers, newcomers to the land, would have seen the empty halls and wondered who had once ruled here. The gold-leafed codices, the laws written in elegant Latin, the broken diadems. These were not the relics of barbarians, but of builders' heirs to both the empire and the wilderness. The Goths had not merely inherited Rome. For 2 centuries, they had become it. And in doing so, they had carried something of its light into the dark that followed. Their story did not end, it echoed through the medieval kingdoms of Spain, through the codes of law that shaped Europe, through the legends of lost kings who would return when their people needed them. The name Goth became mythic, its meaning transformed from destroyers to founders, from exiles to ancestors. So as the evening bells of Toledo fell silent beneath a new crescent moon, the long saga of the Goths reached its close, not with the clang of swords, but with the whisper of continuity. The people who began in the northern mists had crossed 1,000 years of fire and faith, leaving behind not ruins, but roots. And though their kingdom fell, their legacy endured in stone, in scripture, and in the faint, proud echo of their name.